So Alex O'Connor, so you're popping at the moment.
Hi, my name's Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist.
8.5 million views on your last video.
Stop.
He's crazy.
This is like two different worlds colliding.
What is it that you actually do?
I suppose I try to communicate philosophical ideas that are kind of interesting and weird and cool.
So what would you consider to be your biggest argument against the existence of God?
Yeah, I find myself these days spending more time speaking to atheists about the plausibility of God than I do doing the opposite.
But there is this higher power that, if we allow in, can guide us in a way that we could never even comprehend trying to do so. Psychedelics.
Changes everything about the way you see the world, where you hear the world. And so the one thing that it definitely tells us is that our ways of seeing the world, it doesn't have to be that way in principle. What if the wall doesn't even exist? Can I prove it? Can I prove that I'm not in a simulation?
But at some point, like, people just deep in too much shit. Like you, like,
Whoa.
you said you didn't believe the table exists. At what point?
No.
No. At what point? No, let me talk.
Wind your neck in,
At
son.
what point do you have to just accept? Fucking accept.
Here he is.
You fucking showed it.
Yet another podcast.
Get another one.
Oh yeah, what did you get?
What's on that side? Like, look
Which
red.
side? It's through there? No.
No, we're floor one.
Oh, the club.
Club.
Low IQ, Jack, Joseph, and
Radio
Anderson.
Rufus.
That rings a bell. Yeah.
Rufus Rice.
Yeah, fun. This is cool, man.
Sweet, all right, we rolling?
Oh, we going?
Ready to rumble?
We're just rock and roll.
All right then, Alex O'Connor.
Wait,
What?
is everyone staying in the room for this episode?
They can do.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
calm,
why
that's all
not?
good.
Yeah.
All right then, so Alex O'Connor.
What's up, man? What's up, guys?
Firstly, you're popping at the moment. Like, you're absolutely blowing up the place. 8.5 million views on your last video.
Oh, stop it.
It's crazy, but like, what is it that you actually do?
Yeah, good question.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess broadly I'm a philosophy YouTuber.
Okay.
And a podcaster too, because everybody is these days, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose I try to communicate philosophical ideas that are kind of interesting and weird and cool to people who otherwise either wouldn't bother looking into it or would find it a bit sort of like difficult to get into. It all seems a bit sort of dry and academic and whatnot, which a lot of it is. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there too, which I try to communicate to people.
Yeah, because we see a lot of it is like obviously taking on religious people.
Yep.
And why, trying to debunk their arguments for why God may exist or their religion may have any validity.
Sure.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
What is that all about? Are you saying you're an atheist? You don't believe in any of that stuff?
Yeah, I prefer the term agnostic these days because I'm
What does
agnostic
What
about
does that
most-
mean?
It means that you don't know. I mean, so etymologically, like the actual origin of the word, like gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge, and so to be agnostic, gnosis, without knowledge. In the same way that atheism comes from the word theos, which means God. A means without, so it's without God. Atheism.
Got you.
This is going to be a lesson for everyone else. Like,
So-
our audience have a very...
Theo.
This is like two different worlds colliding.
That's why they call it atheism, because it's sort of etymologically just means without God. Agnostics will be people who don't say like, I believe there's no God, I'm an atheist, there's no God. Say like, I don't know, man. How on earth could we possibly know? And some agnostics take that approach. Some agnostics don't think like, there's no way we could know. They just think, look, there's loads of information on this side and loads of information on this side. And personally, for myself, I haven't made my mind up. That makes you an agnostic as well. But there are also agnostics who say it's like impossible to know.
I know we're going to delve deeper into that a lot in this show, but can I just ask, like, how are you here? Like, how have you actually got to where you are now? Because that's quite a unique and niche like route to go down, especially on YouTube.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for it, man. Like it is quite niche, and like I say, it can be really boring. Like a lot of philosophy is quite technical or seemingly irrelevant for a lot of people. You're talking about these weird thought experiments and trolley problems and stuff, and like who cares, And I think that what I try to do is find the nuggets of useful information and interesting information, which has obviously worked. Like I think people realize that although I used to be a bit more of a debate bro, used to be more like, let's rough and tumble on religion and stuff. These days I'm just much more interested. I'm genuinely excited by hearing people's ideas on things. And be it a philosopher that I've got on my podcast, or a physicist who for some reason has agreed to start talking about their philosophical worldview, or it's just some random person from a completely different field, everyone's got something kind of interesting to be like dug into and pulled out. And so I think I'm hoping that what people see in me is a genuine curiosity.
Did you study philosophy?
Yes,
Or you
philosophy and
did?
theology. It was a joint honours
Where?
at Oxford.
Ah.
very bright.
Very fancy, very,
Yeah.
very fancy. I'm really grateful for that too, actually, because my grades weren't great. First time I did my A-levels, I got 3 U's.
Oh, me and you too, brother.
Yeah, man. Yeah, right on. In fact, the only one I didn't was critical thinking, so like
Same.
learning logical fallacies and stuff, and that one I got a D in. But I overslept one of the exams, further maths. I overslept it, and it was at 1 p.m., and I just didn't
Silly
make
goose.
it. And
So are you saying you used to be a bit of a bum?
yeah, 100%. But I had to redo
Is it
the whole
college?
thing. This was, so like sixth form.
Yeah.
It was at, secondary school, but then I had to redo them because you've got to stay in education until you're 18 these days, right? And so had to go back, and I was like, you know what? I kind of want to give it a proper crack this time. So did them again, got A, B, C for AS level, and then just about got A star AA, which is what you need to get
What
to
do you think
Oxford.
switched in your head though? To suddenly be like, oh, I care now, or I want to try now. What do you think that was that made you switch?
It might have been having a YouTube channel, in that I started this when I'm like 16, 17, and when I applied for university, I think it probably had about 150,000 subscribers. And so it was awesome. I was like, this is really, really cool. And I thought, you know what? I do kind of want to pursue this because I'm doing the philosophy thing online now. And I think if I want to not only be taken seriously, but also have interesting things to say, I want to study this. And I thought, you know what? I've got a crack at this because my grades aren't great. But if I can write a personal statement that's got this cool YouTube thing going on, like maybe it could work. And so that motivated me. But also just having good friends, having friends who are ambitious and say to you, you know what, mate, like maybe you like could do that actually. Like not like filling your head with pipe dreams, but sort of realistically like, yeah, give it a go. And I had friends who studied hard and I studied hard with them, and that was that.
So you sort of used university and studying that to sort of give yourself credibility on YouTube.
It's not just about credibility, because it's one thing, like you could say, I just want to get a degree so that I can say, listen to me, I've got something to say. But there is also the element of actually feeling like I'm more credible because I've got the actual like educational material. Like I've learned things that even if I was never allowed to tell anyone I had a degree, I still have benefited greatly from it because I just learned so much. Things that I am happy to share with people these days. So it was a good decision, I think, to go to university. Also stopped me from getting in too much of a YouTube bubble. I mean, I don't know what it's like for you guys. Like, it seems like you've got a whole group of people, like you're all friends, you know each other. There's like 16 billion podcasts all filming in the same building.
Literally.
For me, it's like in a room talking to a camera on my own. And if I'd have just kept that up, decided I'm going to do that for the rest of my life when I was like 17, who knows, I might have never come out of that room. I might still be in there now, just tapping away on my computer,
So what is your like motive to wanting to make content and communicate to the world? Is it that you're trying to get the point of view across of like maybe to convince others of what you believe, or is it you're purely wanting to be challenged and to learn and to almost like see different points of view for your own, like, I guess, enjoyment in life? Is it?
No, I'm just kidding. It's definitely just the excitement of exploring these things. It's the kind of thing where, like, what I love is the idea that I can do what I would love to do anyway. It's that classic thing, taking what you love and turning it into a job. Like, if we were at the pub and these were pints, we could have the same conversation and it would be interesting and fun, hopefully, and I'd still be passionate talking about philosophy. If for whatever reason that I can't understand, people are interested in having an ear in on that, and that can become a job, and I can use that to then talk to even more interesting people and more higher quantities of people.
Mad ting. Alex,
Yes, sir.
where do we come from?
Oof. Well, it depends on your level of explanation, right? And this is actually really important, is that whenever anybody asks a question and you want to explain something, why is this cup here? Why are we here? Whatever.
Are we here?
There are like levels, maybe not. He
loves it.
That's a whole thing.
We had this argument earlier.
There are levels of explanation, right? So you could say, well, why are you here right now? And I could say, because you walked in the room and sat down. That is an explanation of a kind, right? But it only goes so far. So you might also say, like, why am I here in like a biological sense? Like, how on earth do like zygotes like grow into human beings? It seems like you want to push that question all the way back, though. It depends on the context in which you're asking. If you mean like,
So
why
in
is
planet Earth, like, why are you here right now, do you think?
I think I'm here as the result of a series of deterministic causes that probably began around the time of the Big Bang. And what exactly caused the Big Bang in the very beginning is completely outside of our current understanding. But the universe probably had some kind of beginning, and it seems to me like it's been following a set course since the beginning of the universe. It's possible that there's some randomness in the universe. A lot of people look at like quantum physics and they say there's randomness there. That's disputed. And even if there were, it would still be basically out of our control how we ended up here. I think there's just a series of events which cause other events, and that goes on until we get to the present. And I think that's been going since the beginning of the universe.
But what the beginning?
Yeah.
How do you know it's the beginning? What was before the beginning? Surely it's like before the beginning.
Well, that seems like a sensible question, right? Like what came before the Big Bang? But remember, have you ever heard of space-time? Like those words shoved together?
Space-time continuum.
Space-time continuum, yeah. So this is what Einstein did. He showed that space and time are kind of like the same thing, although they're like connected. In that, you know, if something's really heavy and it bends space-time around it, things move slower. You know, like on Interstellar, where they go to the planet, right?
Yep.
So time is literally affected by space. And so it seems like time is a kind of a property of the universe. People used to think that there's a thing called space with objects in it, and it somehow sort of moves through time. And we don't really know what this time thing is. Time is impossible to define. You know, they say that everybody knows what time is until you're asked to define it. Like, what the hell is time, right? And so if time is just like a product of the universe, that means that if the universe had a beginning, that's when time itself began. So if you want to ask what happened before then,
Nothing.
that's a bit like asking what's north of the North Pole.
South Pole.
Well, no.
Well, if you keep going north, you go round the
Yeah,
earth.
but by the time you get over the top, north will be behind you, right? See what I'm saying? So if you have a compass and you're constantly trying to find north, and you walk north and you're like, which way's north? That way, which way's north? That way, that way. And you get to the North Pole, and then you ask, well, which way's north from now? It's like that's...
You are north.
It sounds like a question that's sensible. Like I can say those words and you understand what I'm asking, but when you think about it, it's like it doesn't make sense as a question. What came before the beginning of time might be the same kind of thing. This is just where it started. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's a bit mind, it's hard to think.
So, you know the time thing you're on about?
Yeah.
So that obviously that famous scene in Interstellar where they go down to the planet.
Yeah.
And every minute is like 10 years on Earth.
Yes.
It's like, how does that work?
Because objects bend space-time. So you can imagine space-time as like this massive fabric. So imagine like the air around us, but you can sort of picture it as this four-dimensional fabric. And the way that gravity works is that if I were to throw a ball, or if I were to roll a ball across this table towards you, Joe, then it would just roll this way, right? But imagine this table here was a big bit of fabric, and I put a huge metal weight in the middle, and it sagged like that. Then if I rolled the ball towards you, the ball would go off its course and go towards the metal thing, right?
Yeah.
Because the metal thing is like bending the fabric in such a way that although the ball is going in a straight line, the line itself is bent towards the object. That's how gravity works, right? An object which is in space, like a comet or something, is just moving in a straight line, but the Earth is got so much mass that it literally bends the space-time around it, right? It's like taking the planet, putting it in space, and it's like the fabric. It's like the fabric being like bent around it,
Yeah.
which means when that comet is traveling in a straight line, it bends towards the Earth, and the way it looks to us is that the comet is coming towards the Earth, right? That's how gravity works. Time does the same thing. Time also bends, right? So if you are near a really massive object, and it has to be massive for this to be noticeable, like a black hole.
Yeah.
If you're near a black hole, space-time is so bent around it that you can imagine, for example, you know, if I was moving from this side of the table to this side of the table, and it took me 10 seconds, and then I stretched out that fabric, and I moved at the same speed,
Take any longer.
it would take longer, even though, like, we don't perceive the stretching of the space-time because we're being stretched with it. So it would be as if I've stretched the table, but it looks the same to us, which means that it would look as though that thing's moving slower now, right? So to me, looking at this, I would see a normal-sized table, and I see a really slow-moving thing because it's been stretched out. I just can't see it, right? And that's what's happening near a black hole, is that space-time is being, like, warped and stretched so that things just move at a different rate of time. And this was revolutionary. Like, the idea that time is not constant was such a mind bender because it's so hard to perceive on any kind of small scale. But for example, when they sent satellites into orbit, so the thing that allows you to use GPS on your phone, they need to keep time, right? You're sending signals up and back and they need to keep time. And the scientists said that because you're sending it a bit away from the Earth and the Earth affects the way that time passes, you need to slightly alter the speed of the clock, just ever so slightly, because over years and years, it will add up. And they were right. If you send a clock here and a clock here, and I send this one up into space and it orbits the Earth for 100 years and it comes back down again, they'll show slightly different times. Not because the clocks are imperfect, but because time literally moved faster for one of them than the other. And the same thing happens when you travel really fast. When you get near the speed of light, time also starts changing. So if you got in a train, and that train moved at the speed of light. Now, to move at the speed of light, or just below the speed of light, you'd have to orbit the entire Earth 7 times a second. That's how fast light goes, right? So imagine you got on a train that was going around the Earth 7 times a second. If you got on that train for 1 week, then when you got off the train, the rest of the world will have passed 100 years.
Well, somebody done that experiment?
Not that experiment, because that's practically impossible. But there are
Obviously, I'm just trying
but
to
it's the good question is like, well, how do we know that this is actually, that this is actually?
Because I'm just trying to
this
gauge, like,
works?
how can you trust in that theory and certain theories, like you've mentioned, but then not in others? I'm trying to gauge, like, what is your threshold for I believe this and I don't believe this?
Yeah, in science, it's all about making predictions. You need to be able to say, right, I've got this theory, I think this is how things work, and if I'm right, then we should see this occur. And then you stake it. You say, look, I've got this claim, and we're going to test it. You don't, like, retrospectively explain stuff. You, like, make a prediction, and it comes true. For Einstein, famously, this involved an eclipse, and the way that light itself bent around a massive object, which is something that you can't observe because the sun's too bright, but in a solar eclipse, you get the opportunity to look at light of the sun, like, more closely. I don't know all of the details, but basically Einstein makes this prediction that if my theory is correct, we will measure this, and if classical Isaac Newton mechanics is correct, then we'll measure something else. And Einstein was right. So you can make predictions based on the way that space-time is supposed to curve that you can then measure. With the speed of light thing, I think there is an interesting case, and you'll have to ask a physicist about this, but I remember hearing about these really interesting particles which have no mass or next to no mass, so they basically travel near the speed of light, and they're emitted from somewhere really far away, and we measure them on Earth. The problem is, the time it takes for them to decay isn't long enough for them to reach Earth. So and I wish I knew the details. I wish I knew this would come up. I would have looked it up. Yeah. They're these really interesting little subatomic particles which travel at either the speed of light or near the speed of light, but they shouldn't have enough time to get from where they're emitted to Earth before they disintegrate. But they do reach Earth. Why? Because time is moving slower for the particle, because it's moving near the speed of light. So the fact that it makes it to Earth means that, like, what we've perceived as, a year, for the particle, it's only been, 10 days. So even though it might decay after 10 days and it takes a year to get here, it's fine because it's moving. So you can by detecting those particles, you can be like, oh, like, that's an explanation as to why that happens. I wish I knew what particle it was. Somebody will comment.
How much proof? So that's essentially like a science experiment, and you've proved that experiment to be correct. Essentially, How much proof do you need to start believing things? Because we had an argument earlier that these boys were saying that this table doesn't exist, and I said,
asking the question of, like, what to trust is,
and I said sometimes it doesn't matter,
because
it's okay to say it is, and I know.
It was basically because I watched your existential crisis.
Oh
theory,
yeah.
And one of them is the like any given Thursday thing where, like, the universe could have been
created last Thursday.
Yeah, that one.
And I said, I know.
He says he knows that that's not true because he's got pictures on his phone. But I said the idea behind it is that it could have been created last Thursday and they were just, programmed into it.
But I said it's okay to say it wasn't. Like, we are all sitting around this table, and it's so good to have these discussions.
Yeah.
But we all know that the universe wasn't created last Thursday.
Yeah. Look, I think
Correct.
you're both right. Look, and I'll tell you why. Right? There's a philosopher called G.E. Moore from the 20th century, and he's famous for having done this proof, where there's a lot of debate about whether the external world exists. Is it all an illusion? Are we living in a simulation, or is this real? Do I actually have hands? Yeah. Is there really a table here? And some people, what they do is they say, look, I can't prove, I don't know whether there's a table here, therefore I don't know whether the external world really exists. G.E. Moore just had this, like, intuitive shift where he said, here's the argument. I have hands. If I have hands, it means the external world exists. Therefore, the external world exists.
Agreed.
Now, you could say, how do you know that you have hands? And Yeah, you can either take the approach of being like oh, like I can't prove that, or skepticism, or you can just be like, look, come on, man, like it's here, we all know it, right? Yeah. There is a level at which any kind of knowledge has to start with essentially a brute fact, just something you assume without proof. Now, for some people, believing in the existence of your hands or the existence of the table isn't deep enough to be the brute fact, right? So you might think, well, maybe this table doesn't exist. I'm not sure, but how could I know? Well, I can see it with my eyes.
You
well,
touch it.
Do I believe that my sense data is accurate? Like, are my eyes giving me an accurate representation of reality? And a lot of people say, yeah, well, they don't just say yeah, they act like that, right? Like, we all act as though our sense data gives us an accurate representation of reality. Whether we like it or not, we just believe it. The question is, are we justified in that belief? That's what the philosopher might ask. Like, is that a justified belief? And for some people, it's like, it doesn't matter, because you're not going to stop believing that. So let that just be the basis of our epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, and we can build up from that. So philosophers will point out that any area of inquiry tends to start with an assumption, right? You might call it an axiom. And some people will say, something like my sense data being accurate is nowhere near certain enough to treat it as an axiom. Whereas others will say, sure it is.
But do you not think like those people are then they're just like, I think it's good to ask questions about everything, but at some point, like, people just deep in too much shit.
That's true.
Like,
possible to be too skeptical.
Like you. Like,
Whoa.
you said you didn't believe the table exists. At what point?
No.
At what point? No, let me talk.
Wind your neck in.
At what point are you going to start then really acting like how you believe and stop putting the microphone on the table? Because how could you put the microphone on the table because the table doesn't exist?
Yeah, but does the microphone even exist?
Well, why are we even here then?
No,
If that's how you feel, just stand there. How can you stand there?
But don't have legs, mate.
Like, how can you stand there if you don't believe you have legs? You get onto this cycle of just like going too deep into everything. At what point do you have to just accept?
No, I mean, the argument is endless. But like, what I wasn't saying earlier is that I believe that, as in, like,
Do you believe it?
No, and I agree with your point that we have to believe that there is something here. We exist. You are here. You are there. Otherwise, but do we believe that purely because it's just a more comfortable belief to believe that you are actually real? You are here. You are real.
I am, yes.
But there's no physical
No, it's
way.
just fun and
Yeah,
games.
you would say that though, wouldn't you?
I would
Yeah,
say that.
if you
Yeah, I
weren't
would.
real.
It's just fun and
What you really
games.
know is that I am here right now because I'm doing
How can
it.
you? No, you can't
'Cause
do
I'm
that.
doing
Dude,
it.
No, you
yes,
can't do
I'm
yes,
experiencing it.
yes. Okay, right. What has just happened in front of my very eyes is René Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. I'm not even kidding, right?
I knew that's what you were going to say.
So like,
René Descartes.
have you ever heard the phrase "I think, therefore I am"?
Yes.
Have you come across this before?
Yes.
So this is a guy called Descartes, right? Who's one of these old paintings of an old man that you see in a university somewhere. And what he did was basically realized what you're thinking about right now, which is like, well, okay, like I could be wrong about so much, like I think that you see blue in the same way as I do, but maybe you don't. But wait, it's more fundamental, because what if the wall doesn't even exist? Can I prove it? Can I prove that my hands exist? Can I prove that I'm not in a simulation? And Descartes is just like freaking out. He's like, I don't know what to do. So in order to find out what he can know, he takes everything that it's possible to doubt and treats it as if it's false and sees what's left over. Because importantly, there's a difference between saying, I think the table doesn't exist, and saying, I'm not convinced that the table exists. I don't know. I don't think I have good reason to think it does exist. That doesn't mean you proactively believe it definitely doesn't exist. So, like, Joe, if you were saying, like, I'm not sure if I can justify my belief in the table, and you say, well, do you really believe that the table doesn't exist? It's like, no, you might not. You might not be saying the table doesn't exist. You might just be saying, I've got no reason to think it does. So Descartes takes all of the stuff that you can doubt, the existence of the table, the existence of my hands, the fact that I could be a brain in a vat, all of this and treats all of it as false. What's left over? What is the one thing that it is impossible to doubt? It's like not on a practical level.
My brain.
Yes, or more precisely, like could you?
My thoughts.
Yes.
My consciousness.
Exactly, because you could imagine that like the brain is actually an illusion, and you can conceptually separate the thoughts you're having from the physical brain, right? But like, just imagine yourself not existing. It's not possible, because as soon as you're doing the imagining is a kind of thinking. So when Descartes is doubting everything, he realizes that doubt is a kind of thought, right? When you doubt something, you're thinking. So doubt is a kind of thought. But in order to think, there has to be something doing the thinking. And so to even doubt my own existence requires my existence. So he says, I think, therefore I am. As long as I'm thinking, I know that there is something that exists. Now, crucially, this does not mean that Descartes, with his hair and his hands in his chair, exists. He can't know that. All he knows is there is some kind of thinking being that exists. And that's where he starts. It's like, of all of the skepticism, what I can know is that I, in some form, exist, which is what you said a second ago, Joe, right? You were like, I know that I'm here because I'm thinking, like I'm thinking about stuff, so I know that I'm here. That's what Descartes realized. But you could be, the stuff you're thinking about could be wrong. Like you might not actually have this body, you might not be in this room, you might be in a vat somewhere, but there is some kind of version of you that exists. And that's where he starts. And from that, he builds up his epistemological framework.
So how would I go about articulating and proving that this table exists?
Well, a lot of people say you can't do it. For Descartes, the way he did it was to say, okay, so I know that I exist, but maybe my sense data is all inaccurate, right? Maybe I'm sort of being deceived. So his version of the simulation hypothesis was to imagine an evil demon, Descartes' evil demon. He was like, imagine there was this evil creature that was giving me all this false information, was prodding my brain, giving me false sensory data, and it was all an illusion. How could I know that's not the case? And Descartes' only way to do this, and this is controversial, is Descartes first proved the existence of God. After proving the existence of God, he decided that those intuitions that you believe most undeniably, things like maths, 2 + 2 is 4, stuff like that, is not the kind of thing that if a good God existed, he would allow you to be deceived about. Like if a good God exists, he wouldn't allow everyone to be deceived all the time. Therefore, we're not being deceived. Therefore, we can know that 2 + 2 is 4. And we can start knowing true things about the universe. The controversial thing for Descartes then is that he first had to prove the existence of God. And a lot of people think that his proof doesn't work. Maybe it does. But as you rightly point out, you can interestingly find out that you can know you exist. But then how do you build upon that? Well, how do I know that this table exists? And a lot of people say you just don't know.
I want to take you back to that part about God. Because I think that's kind of where you were pushing us down when you spoke about where do we come from. Because obviously
right.
you have, I know you said you're agnostic, but you're atheist views.
Yeah.
The origin of man, is that just a series of events, or have we been placed here? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the only answer that certainly I can give is that I don't know. I have ideas and we can explore different theories that people have, but obviously I don't have the answer. Like not with a confidence that I could tell you I've got the key. Because if I did, I'd probably be a lot more famous if I actually knew the answer to why we're here. But people have all kinds of ideas. You said man, the origin of man. There are two things that we could separate out. There's the origin of mankind, of humans. There's also the origin of the universe itself. Because conceivably there could have been a universe with no people in it. And that still would have been a great mystery. Why does that universe exist? But we've got this added mystery that within this universe of stuff like tables and glasses and plants over there, we have this consciousness. There's something that it's like to be you. You have a first-person experience of the world. That's really weird. Why does that exist? And how does it exist? So along the way, there are all of these mysteries. And the first one is, how does the thing get going in the first place? Why is there this origin of the universe, this Big Bang? But okay, why? There are a few ways to answer this question. One is to say that at the Big Bang, the moment of the Big Bang or just before the Big Bang, everything is condensed into something so small. It's called a singularity. It's the same thing you get at the middle of a black hole. It's like this unbelievably, almost infinitely dense set of matter. And everything is so crunched up that basically the laws of physics just stop working. So our conceptions of time, of causation, of all of this kind of stuff just might not apply. So there's one sense in which it might just be impenetrable to us. We might just never be able to properly investigate it. But other people say, look, the universe began to exist, and anything which begins to exist has a cause. Things don't just begin to exist for no reason. Right? You're not worried that while you're here at home in your kitchen, a horse has just popped into existence and is now destroying your furniture, right? You're not worried about. Why are you not worried about that?
Doesn't happen.
Because things like that don't. But why not? How do you know that something like that couldn't just happen for no reason?
I just know.
You just know. At the very least, you assume this principle that things don't just begin to exist without some kind of cause. Okay, well, the universe began to exist, so scientists tell us. Therefore, it had some kind of cause. So the universe must have a cause, right? That's where that argument leads. Okay, says like the atheist or the skeptic, well, what kind of cause are you talking about? That could be anything. Could be a law of physics. Could be anything. Maybe there are a few things we can know about this cause. If it exists outside of the universe, it has to be spaceless, so it's immaterial. It has to be timeless, it exists outside of time. It also has to have some kind of causal power. So we've got this entity which is immaterial, which is outside of time, and which has some kind of causal power.
Could be called a god.
Looking a little bit suspicious, right? And here's the thing that might be really interesting, right? Suppose you've got this cause, and we know that whatever caused the universe has the power to bring about the universe, right? We know that it has, let's say, the causal efficacy to bring about the effect, right? It has the relevant causal power. If A causes B, right, and A exists timelessly, then B should also be timeless, right? Because if A has the causal ability to bring about B, then if A is timeless, B should also be timeless, because A brings about B. But we've got a timeless A, but a B which has a certain set time, right? The universe began to exist at a point in time. So in other words, you've got a timeless creator and a timed creation. How does that work? It means that the cause in its infinite, timeless state must sort of do something, at some point. Because if it was just this impersonal force that brought about universes, then if it existed timelessly, the universe should exist timelessly as well. But if you've got a timeless being who at some point creates something at a point in time, it must do something. So now you've got a spaceless, timeless creator of the universe that does stuff. It's not just this abstract force or something. It somehow changes. Maybe it has a will, or maybe it has some kind of nature that moves around. And as you say, it's starting to look a lot like God. So some people look at the beginning of the universe and say the only explanation for this is God. And I want to clarify that a lot of people think that what religious people do is they come along and they say the God of the gaps. You might have heard that phrase, where they say, you just say that when science can't explain something, you just say God did it. But science is constantly explaining things, and one day we won't need your God anymore. An argument like this doesn't say, we don't know what caused the universe, therefore it must be God. An argument like this says, there are things we do know about the universe. We know that it was the beginning of time and space. We know that it had a beginning. We know that it must have a cause, and we've just explored what properties that cause must have. And then I didn't say, you said that looks a bit like God. So it's a ground-up argument for the existence of something which people might call God. So that's one answer to your question, which is that something, which call it God if you want or not, it's up to you, but some kind of timeless, spaceless, immaterial creator of the universe brought the universe about. Another answer to your question, why did the universe begin to exist, is that it just did for no reason. It just happened, right? Seems pretty unconvincing, a little bit weird, but weird stuff happens when you're looking at a singularity, right? If the universe came from nothing, here's something kind of funny. If there were true nothingness, there wouldn't be the constraining axiom that something can't come from nothing. Right? You've got this rule, something can't come from nothing. That's a rule. But if there's nothing, that rule doesn't exist. So something can come from nothing. So universe out of nowhere. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So look, it gets a bit sort of silly. But the classical answer and the most popular answer throughout human history to your question is that there's some kind of creative agent who brought the universe about.
Rather than the word than God, put that aside. You think there's some sort of creator?
Well,
do you think that's a conscious thing?
To be clear,
it's decided.
I don't know.
You don't.
I don't know if this is the case. I think it's an interesting argument, and it's plausible. But yeah, I think that I don't know about consciousness, because consciousness is quite a complex and difficult thing to define. It's got lots of facets. But certainly the idea that it has some kind of will is not a far stretch, given that you've got a finite effect from an infinite cause. If you've got an infinite cause, but a finite effect, then that infinite cause must at some point do something, which seems to align well, or might be explained well by the existence of a will.
So what about then, plausible. In terms of just us as individuals, our own consciousness, us as beings, do you think that's just a random, we're born with this personality and that's it, and then we die and then we're gone? Or some people may believe that we are our consciousness and we decide that we want to come into this being and live this life for some sort of reason, motive. What are your thoughts on that? Consciousness, why we are who we are, and how that comes about?
Yeah, well, there's a few things to pull apart there, which is like, firstly, is consciousness something different from just like your brain, like your material brain? Because you had this idea that maybe before we're born, we sort of exist consciously and make a decision to come into this world, which, by the way, is what Mormons believe. They believe that every person existed pre their birth, and they make a decision. Like they say, like, do you want this to happen? And they sort of consent to like coming into this body, and then they forget about that, prenatal existence.
Right.
Pretty wacky, right? But before you get to the question of what was this soul doing before the physical body, the first thing you need to ask is it separable? Because if the mind or the consciousness is the same thing as the physical brain, that means that when the brain exists, you have consciousness, and when there's no brain, there's no consciousness. So when you die, if I blow up your head or something, it's gone, it's over. And before you existed, there was no consciousness of you until the brain began
That's
to
not
exist.
the case, though, is it?
What do you mean?
If you're asleep,
Yep.
no, it's true.
Personally.
If you're asleep or you're in a coma, you still have your brain, but you're unconscious.
That's true. So it may be that, well, when you're in a dream, a lot of the time when you're dreaming, you are unconscious. That's true. But it may be that in order to have consciousness, you need a brain. Like the brain does consciousness, but the brain doesn't always have to do consciousness. It's a bit like this light that's probably off screen, right? You've got a light up there, and you can turn off the light, and you can turn it on again. And I could say, like, there's no way that this glow is just a material object like this bulb or whatever. That makes no sense. But there are some people who think, no, it is literally just the bulb. And the fact that you sometimes can turn it off and turn it on again doesn't mean that the light is anything more than the bulb. It just means that sometimes it switches off. So the brain produces consciousness somehow, but sometimes, it switches off when you're under anesthetic or when you're sleeping or whatever. It can switch off. But it is just the same thing as the brain, or like the brain is crucial to bring about consciousness. Other people think that consciousness is this like totally separate thing that exists immaterially, that somehow the brain like connects to. Like imagine a radio like signal, and there's a metal antenna, and the antenna, you need the antenna to get the picture on the screen, but the antenna isn't producing the picture on the screen. It's like honing into these ways. And some people think of the brain a little bit like that. You need the brain to have the conscious experience, but the brain is actually just like an antenna for this immaterial weird thing which we call consciousness. Okay, so you've got these two views. Consciousness is material. It's made of the same stuff as the table. It's just the same thing as the brain. And consciousness is this weird immaterial thing which exists separately from the brain. Both of those views have really interesting problems, right? If you think that consciousness is separate from the brain, you think it's its own thing. So there are people who are called dualists, as in dual, two. You have sort of two natures to you, a physical nature and a spiritual nature. 75% of Americans are dualists. Just intuitively, they think that they have a soul, they have a mind that's separate from their material body. The question then is like, why is it that this immaterial brain, this consciousness, interacts with my physical brain? Like, why is it that if I prod my brain, it affects my mind? And I can't change my mind without something happening to my brain. And it seems like brains don't crop up without minds, and minds don't crop up without brains. That's a little bit weird. And it's not like, it's a bit of a mystery. If the mind is immaterial, if consciousness is immaterial, it has no spatial location, because space is physical, right? So if it's non-physical, why does my consciousness connect to this brain and not that brain?
Yeah.
Like, why? It's called the interaction problem. How do you get an interaction between a physical thing and a non-physical thing? Those are completely different entities. It's like getting an interaction between the number 362 and a banana. Like, they're different. A number is an abstract thing that exists in your imagination. A banana is a physical. They literally, how would they interact? That doesn't even make any sense. If the mind is immaterial and abstract and the brain is physical, how do they interact? So that's the problem for the dualist. What is that connection?
Yeah.
But is there a sense of like you have to accept that you can't figure everything out? There are certain things that like, oh, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't mean it's not happening.
Absolutely, but that's why when you ask questions like, where does consciousness come from, or how did the universe begin to exist, a lot of the time the best answer is just like, I have no idea, but let's explore some ideas and see what convinces you. Because what will happen, right, is we'll have a conversation, and maybe, I don't know, maybe we're getting a bit too into it, maybe it's getting a bit weird, and some of the words that we're using, or we're losing people, like, who knows? But if we have a productive conversation, you might come away thinking, you know what, dude, like, I definitely, like, the mind is immaterial. And somebody else might say, no, it's connected to the brain. All you're doing with these conversations is working out what you believe.
You know the question you just asked then about it doesn't matter? Isn't that my entire argument about the table, though?
And it's also like just disregarding it and going, no, I'm going to just ignore that because life would be more easier and straightforward to not comprehend
No,
those
you
ideas.
just said it doesn't matter.
No,
That's
no.
what I'm saying about the table.
But I'm saying in the sense of like, if you can't figure something out, doesn't mean that it's not happening. That's what I said. As in, like, just because you can't figure out how the connection between like your soul and your brain, how can that operate? How are they separate? The interaction problem. That doesn't mean it's not happening.
Yeah.
Just because you can't figure it out. Do you get me?
I spoke to a philosopher called Richard Swinburne, who
He's trying.
he's a dualist, right? And so he believes that there is a mind and a body and they interact. And I said to him, like, but how do they interact then? And his answer was like, well, they just do. I don't know how they do, but we just know that they do. Because I've got arguments to believe that the mind is immaterial, but I've also got a brain. I don't know how that interacts, but like I know that it does, you know? And so if I'm understanding you correctly, the fact that it's a mystery, this interaction problem, isn't necessarily a critique of dualism. Because you could say, well, the interaction, but how do they interact? And one way of looking at that is to go, yeah, good point, dualism must be false. And another way is to say, yeah, good point, but we know it does happen, but I don't know why, you know? The one interesting thing is that you might have two consciousnesses inside of you.
Is this the left and the right
Yeah.
from the existential?
Yeah, I talked
Okay.
about it in that video too.
Yeah.
This is a mind bender. It will blow both of your minds. I mean, like,
What about mine?
both of your internal minds.
You're already there, mate.
You haven't got one.
Each of you have two. I mean, it'll blow both of your minds,
My left side and my right
both
side.
of your minds. Yeah. So you know that the brain is split into two hemispheres,
Yes.
right? If you've seen a brain, it looks like it's got two bits. And you probably have heard people talk about right brain and left brain, right? And there's a lot of pseudoscience in that. But there are some things that we know are true. The left hemisphere of your brain broadly controls the right side of your body. And the right hemisphere broadly controls the left side of the body. So the left visual field, the left arm, right hemisphere, right? There are some really interesting people who have undergone a particular operation which has severed the connective tissue between the right and the left hemisphere.
Why?
It used to happen as a treatment for severe cases of epilepsy. Especially, I don't think they do it anymore, but the connective tissue between the two hemispheres is called the corpus callosum, connects them. And so they undergo a corpus callosotomy, where they chop it in half. And people who had really, really bad epilepsy, having all kinds of seizures, one way to try to reduce it was to sever this brain connection so that there was less communication, right? And if you met such a person, you wouldn't know, because they would be talking to you as I'm talking to you now. You wouldn't notice that anything has changed, except under some very specific circumstances. So experimenters have done experiments. People have done experiments on so-called split brain patients, people who've had that split done, and consensually, I should say. You know, they signed up for the studies, and they found some really interesting things. So, for example, if you like put up some barriers and stuff, you could show information just to somebody's left visual field, so they don't see it with this side; they only see it with this side, right? And so they did that. Now remember, the right hemisphere sees out of the left and the left hemisphere sees out of the right. But also, they seem to govern different things. Like, speech and communication seems to be related to the left hemisphere, not the right hemisphere. So all the words that I'm saying to you right now are sort of being governed by the left hemisphere. So here's something interesting that they've done. They showed somebody's left visual field, so just their right hemisphere, a picture. But they've only shown it to the right hemisphere of the brain, so they show it through their left visual field. And say it's a picture of an apple. And then they say to them, like, what can you see? Like, what are you looking at? And they'll go, I have no idea. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't see anything. And then they give them a piece of paper and a pen and ask them to draw something, and they draw an apple. Because the part of their brain which deals with like action and behavior and creative output has seen the apple, but the part of the brain that deals with language and communication hasn't seen the apple. Isn't that bloody weird, right? So it seems like the two hemispheres are doing different things. People who have damage to the left hemisphere will sometimes find that their right hand starts acting sort of of its own accord. And I should make sure I get this the right way round. If you've got damage to the left hemisphere, then your right hand will start making like grabbing motions sometimes. Like it might just like grab the side of the table, and I sort of didn't control that. Whereas if the right hemisphere is damaged, there have been reported cases of people's left hands going funny, but instead of grabbing things, they do feeling motions. You know, they'll like feel things, which you got to be careful with.
Yeah.
But that because of the fact that in either case, right, the damage to the hemisphere makes your arms act funny, but they're doing different things. The left brain is numbers and sort of putting things organizationally into compartments and boxes, so it likes to grab. The right hemisphere is the artistic one. It's where creativity comes from, so it feels, right? I'll give you one more example. This is bloody amazing, right? So they would show an instruction to just the right visual field. Bear in mind they're in an experiment, so they're told, follow the instructions of the experimenter. So these split brain patients are shown just to their right hemisphere an instruction which says, get up and walk over to that side of the room. And they see it, and they get up, and they walk over to the other side of the room. And then the experimenter says to them, why'd you just get up and walk to the other side of the room? And guess what they say?
Hello?
You would think, like after everything I've just said, it would be amazing enough, right, if they just said, I don't know. I don't know why I walked over to the room. But it's not even that they do that. They come up with an explanation. Like this happens all
As
the
in
time.
they just fake something.
This is the weird thing. They're not faking it. They say something like, I was thirsty, so I was going to get some water. Or, I was uncomfortable, so I was stretching my legs. And they're not lying. They're not just inventing it, and they're not being awkward. Their brain has literally just invented a reason retrospectively that they now believe.
Like to make it make sense in your own brain.
Exactly. So based on this, some scientists have called the left hemisphere the interpreter. And it's the right brain that like just sort of does stuff. It feels its way through the world, and it's the left brain's job to interpret why it's doing that. And that's why it's connected to like language, so you can explain yourself and you can think in terms of like reason and argument. But it seems to suggest that the two brains are sort of doing different things, right? And so this is the case in split brain patients, right? If you show that information, if you say go over there to the right hemisphere, they'll walk over and then they'll have a completely disconnected reason as to why they did that. You can't reproduce that experiment in a normally functioning human brain because you can't separate the visual fields like that. But it doesn't mean that the same thing isn't going on. So it's possible that most of what we do is based on action. We just intuit things. We just do things in the world. We act first, think later. And even when we are completely convinced of our own reasoning, it's something that our brain has invented to justify what are essentially just emotional, doings. Pretty fascinating stuff, right? And it seems to suggest that there are at least two sort of competing forces within you. One of the earliest indications of this kind of stuff was something which I think was first reported in the 19th century. They called it alien hand syndrome, where a woman was reported to have had her right hand start attacking her. It just like started trying to strangle her, and she had to use the rest of her body to take it off. It was like the hand was just going absolutely mental. And so it sometimes seems like people have, it's quite rare, but you can look it up, it's got a Wikipedia entry, alien hand syndrome, that people have like limbs which have a mind of their own, right? And so some people with alien hand syndrome, it might be like they pour themselves some coffee and their hand just like pours it out again. Or one hand puts the trousers on and the other hand takes the trousers off, right? And the most common people that this like shows up in, the most when this occurs, it's most commonly in people who've had a corpus callosotomy, who've had the hemispheres split in two. So it seems like they're more prone to the hemispheres wanting to act independently of each other, which is really, really interesting, right? Yeah, and the final, I suppose, mystery or interesting thing about all of this, that connective tissue, the corpus callosum, which connects the right and the left hemisphere, we've studied it, we've looked at it, we know roughly what it does. It connects them, but it does more to inhibit communication between them than to facilitate it. So it does allow them to communicate, but the corpus callosum is constantly working to keep them separate as well. Like when it needs to or when it wants to, it keeps them separate. So there is some kind of evolutionary advantage to keeping them separate, but not so separate that they start literally acting of their own accord, but separate enough that they're both governing different things and that they can work together when they need to, but they can also work separately when they don't. It's weird, right?
I'd love to know your thoughts on like spirituality and spirits and like living different past lives. and where people sort of get those feelings from.
Yeah, like the people that have like can recite. Oh yeah, in my previous life,
Yeah.
I lived in Scotland in this house, and then they actually take their parents to that
Fought in
house.
World War II.
Yeah.
We have to talk about your shroom trip a little bit here to give.
But
Wait,
I was-
wait. This is slightly separate though.
Yeah,
This
you know,
is slightly yeah.
is
Because
it
there's
the-
people that have like counted that their previous lives, like, but
like-
actually taken their yeah. So what's your take on
but
that?
also to go deeper onto how you felt, I'd love to know where that feeling had come from for you as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's you're right that people do in normal circumstances feel this. I don't know much about it, but I have heard that there is this phenomenon of people who, like, up to a certain age, this happens in children a lot, like up to a certain age seem to sometimes have some memory of like a past life, and you get some like eerily accurate predictions, right? I don't know enough about these cases to comment on them. It's a little bit like near-death experiences where people sort of die and then come back and they see weird things that they shouldn't have been able to see. And I do think that they are legitimately really strange and kind of creepy. And I haven't looked enough into the individual cases to like know if maybe like there's some funny business going on. I have no idea. But I'm not the kind of like atheist skeptic to just on principle be like, that's obviously ridiculous or whatever. Like, I love weird and interesting things. I mean, I just told you that like you might have two brains that do their own stuff and that like that's pretty fucking weird, right? That's a strange thing. So when someone says to me like, you know, consciousness can move from one person into another person, or at least in some degree, like stranger things have happened. Stranger things might have happened like in my brain in the past 5 minutes. So I've got time for it, but I don't know much about the details.
Okay.
But it sounds like you might have had such an experience.
Well, no. I mean, regarding psychedelics,
Yeah.
it's another realm.
Oh,
Things
yeah.
like ayahuasca,
Yeah.
magic mushrooms. Have you explored that at all?
Never ayahuasca. Shrooms, yes. LSD, yes.
What are your thoughts on them?
2CB, yes. Phenomenal experience. I think something not to mess around with. I always like to it's really fun to talk about, right? And it's past tense. Like, oh, I had this crazy experience. Even a bad experience, you can be like, well, this is really interesting. But like, you know, people listening who are sort of like, yeah, cool, like, let's go and do some drugs. Like, I'm not going to do the whole, like, don't take drugs PSA, but take them seriously. And I mean more seriously than you would take other drugs.
Yeah.
Cannabis, cocaine, ketamine, whatever. Like, take them all seriously. They can be dangerous. They can, you know, mess up your bladder. They can kill you on an overdose, whatever. Psychedelics are psychological. They're psychological. They are in a different category of effect that they will have on you. So be extremely careful and be ready and start with a low dose. Like, just have a tiny little bit. Feel what kind of happens. Notice that, you know, everything starts to look a bit funny and you feel a bit different and music sounds different. Get used to that so that when you decide whether you want to go deeper, you kind of have a taste of what you're getting into. Don't just dive in at the deep end. I'm sure some people have done that. They've just gone straight in and they probably are grateful for it because it just hit them like a ton of bricks. But it's such a risky thing to do because if you have a bad trip,
Horrendous.
just unfathomable psychological consequences.
What do you think is happening though when you're happening during these trips? Is it your brain just physically connecting with this drug and it's altering your chemistry, or is it your consciousness is getting taken to wherever?
Well, again, we don't know, and it depends on your view of consciousness. But one thing that is for sure is that like these drugs don't give your brain anything that's not already there. This is the really weird thing, right? Like, it's not like you've swallowed a bunch of dopamine or a bunch of neurons that are going to like swim into your brain and start like acting. Like, all it's doing is affecting what your brain does. All of the stuff to produce a psychedelic trip is in your brain right now. It just needs to somehow sort of be activated in the same way that if I were to like cut your finger off, you would feel pain. And I could have that effect on you. You don't feel pain right now, but everything that your brain needs to do to produce this feeling of pain is already there in the brain. It's just ready to be activated when I cut your finger off or something, right? Same thing's true of psychedelic drugs, right? As far as I know, you know, I'm not a...
But it's still altering the chemistry in this. It's adding things to it. It's changing the levels of things,
So
right?
something's literally being added in that, like, you're swallowing a tab or a pill, but I don't know exactly what the chemistry is. I mean, maybe something significant is added to the brain, but like when I spoke to Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist and popular philosopher, one of the things that he said, which stuck with me, was this thought that like it's just making your brain do more or less of what it already does and can do, which is pretty strange, right? And the thing that psychedelics really do is I think they allow you, it's one of the only ways, apart from maybe like dreaming, to sort of step outside of your own perception. You know how we were asking, like, does the table exist and stuff like that? Like, those are quite difficult questions to come across. Like, you don't just naturally, when you're like 10, start thinking that the world could be a simulation. You have to really have some reflective capacity to recognize that I can't step outside of my eyes and my ears. I can't step outside of my own head. But like, if I reflect enough, I'm like, oh, in theory that would be possible. I don't know what it would look like, but maybe this is all fake. Psychedelics kind of allow you to actually do it, right? Because it changes everything about the way you see the world, the way you hear the world. Things feel different, things taste different. And so the one thing that it definitely tells us is that our ways of seeing the world, our understanding of the relationship between the world around us and the way we perceive it, is probably not necessary. It doesn't have to be that way in principle, because when you take a psychedelic drug, it all changes and your interaction with the world is different. The world isn't changing. Your perception of the world is changing. And it changes so radically that even though now we're not tripping, we can start to notice that the fact that I perceive stillness and movement, the fact that the colors look the way they do, all of that might be essentially contingent on the way my brain happens to be acting right now. Which means that there's a lot more scope for saying that what we think are just like, objective understandings of how the world actually is are actually much more to do with our perceptions of the world, if you know what I mean.
Okay, so how, obviously some people find that they can get healing from certain traumas and clarity that otherwise they haven't been able to find from using things like mushrooms, ayahuasca. What do you think that is? If it's already within the brain, what could that drug be doing to allow that to come through?
I think because, like, one of the ways that people overcome trauma is by facing it, right? So important in psychological, like therapy. I don't know a ton about it, but as far as I understand, one important thing to do is to like revisit your childhood. Like if you're a Freudian psychoanalyst, you might want to revisit your childhood, and you go back there and you start to realize that, gosh, I'd sort of shut that off mentally. If you've undergone a traumatic experience, one way you might therapize yourself is like, you can imagine the person who's had some traumatic experience 5 years ago and they never talked about it. They never opened up. They just didn't change since. And you sort of say to them, like, you need to process this. You need to, because it's in there somewhere. You've just shut yourself off from it, right? And so one important thing that therapists might do is safely, consensually, and carefully bring that to the fore, right? And it's already in the brain. It's not like they've forgotten this thing happened, but in the way that, like, that Paris is the capital of France, right? Did you know that 10 seconds ago? Yeah, but like it wasn't there in your brain, but it was still sort of in there somewhere. Right. It just wasn't at the fore, right? So it just brings something that was already there to the fore. What psychedelics do, experientially for me, I don't know about the science, is they just take everything that is somewhere in there and they just bring it out and they put it in front of you and they say, this is what's here, like it or not. And you don't, like a normal, if you're in therapy and you start going like, oh, I did this thing, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe, oh God, no, I don't want to go there anymore. You can shut it down and you can come back to it tomorrow. With psychedelics, you're on the ride. It's not gonna stop. And that's why I think people have good trips and bad trips. They say like, oh, make sure you're in a good place. Make sure you've got a good environment. It's not like it's some kind of hack. It's not like you've got this drug and if you go to like a pretty beach and you make sure you're with your friends, like, oh, you'll have a good time. No, the reason people say that is because what this drug is going to do is it's going to reveal yourself to yourself. It's going to put up a mirror. It's going to take every single thought that you have, every single perception that you didn't even realize that you're having, and it's going to put it right in front of you. So if you're depressed and you're upset and you're like riddled with anxiety and you're not sure if you're married to the right woman or whatever, that is all just going to come up, and that's going to be a bad trip. But if you're in a good place, you're a well-integrated person, you know who your friends are, you know what your values are, and you can appreciate it, then you probably have a good trip. And some people are sort of halfway in between and, have something halfway in between. But I think that's probably all that's going on. So the reason people get healing from it is the same reason people get traumatized by it. I know people who've taken psychedelics and it took them weeks to recover. There are people who took psychedelics and still haven't recovered because they've had such a bad trip that it has so fundamentally altered their understanding of reality that they just can't go back to normal. It will just bring it to the fore. So for some people, that's very healing.
How do you think it brings it to the fore? Why do you think it does that? Because, I mean, I've experienced, like, I remember sitting there and feeling like it was almost like this demon and what the frick, like this thing that almost has power over me. And what I feel is that was almost like the chimp part of my brain that's like very emotional based. Like, I want to eat the chocolate. I want to freaking like watch the pornography. I want to get pleasure. Like, do you know what I mean? It was almost like all this clear as day clarity that like how I was feeding that part of the brain that I don't want to be run by. Like I want my more like human part of the brain to almost be what I'm operating by. It almost came so clearly, and I'm like, what is controlling that? It's almost like a lesson. Like, here you go. This is what you are doing to make your brain operate in the way that you don't want. And then here's how you can fix that. Like, what decides that comes through? Because that's not. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I do know what you mean, and I don't know why that happens. I would suspect, like, I don't know, because what psychedelics do, for whatever reason, is they seem to just take the guardrails off, right? I think there's a famous description of psychedelics. I think it was someone like Joe Rogan or someone says this, where he sort of describes it as like, you know, you've been going down like a sled for all of your life, and you'd been going down on this particular slide or whatever, and taking psychedelics is a bit like getting rid of those guardrails, and you realize you can just go anywhere, and it sort of opens up this kind of freedom. And I think that a lot of the clarity that you perceive in a psychedelic experience is clarity that would be available to you through other means, because you already know before you take the psychedelic drugs. If I said to you, you know, there is like a part of you which is more hedonistic, which is more governed by your so-called chimp brain. I mean, the way you've just described it, right? You're not tripping right now, but you can put it into words that you understand, which is there's kind of this part of me which, like, you know, wants to be unhealthy, wants to watch porn, wants to, you know, whatever it is. And because psychedelics just remove the perceptual barriers, it just allows you to, like, perceive that more clearly and in, like, a new way. I don't know, though. Like, I mean, it's a real mystery, right?
Weird,
but it sounds like you had quite a profound experience, which is to say,
I've had some weird ones.
and you said you saw some kind of demon-looking thing.
Well, it was almost like looking down. It was like what I described was like, yeah, like that the ego, the part of me that.
But what did it look like?
Dark,
As in,
evil,
did you
bad
see, like,
character.
was it akin to sort of like looking at the table and there's like something sat on the table? Or...
No. It was almost like metaphorically, and then
like
it's weird. That's how I describe it. But I mean, beyond like during that same mushroom trip, I mean, 3 days prior to this, I'd done a meditation retreat in Thailand. Right, 3 days non-stop, 4 hours a day of meditation.
Yeah.
And I wondered if I was somehow like a bit more connected to what can come through. Like, you know, if you're really stressed out and you're, you know, boiling up, you probably can't think as clear. I wonder if I'd come off the back of these 3 days of clarity that now, I don't know, seeing more clearly things that maybe I'd stored in my brain and was avoiding, were able to pass through a little bit more. Well, I had that experience, but I also, me and my friend that I was doing it with, we were communicating telepathically, like legitimately, and we've recited what we were saying. We left our bodies. That's literally like our experience. We were shown the timeline of our existence. And we were both communicating the whole time and both looking at the same thing.
Yeah.
Sounds ridiculous. But then we were shown, like, by the end of it, what enlightenment is, what you'd describe as like heaven or like this bright light. And then that's where we're all from, but we've decided to come back here. And we landed in our bodies exactly the same time, looking up in floods of tears like, mate, that surely wasn't real. That wasn't real. But then we sit there and we recited everything that happened back to each other, quoting exactly what happened. And it was like, mate, there's a somewhere else. There is a somewhere else, and we've just been there. And obviously, I've told the story. I've written it all down in my notes. Everyone's like, mate, you're just off your tits.
Do you write it down?
Yeah, I wrote it all
to anybody
down.
listening, if you're going to have any, or if you've recently had any kind of interesting experience, like, always write it down. You would be amazed at what you can forget, even if it's like super significant. You forget the details. Write it down immediately.
I will say, we don't say you're off your tits. Like, we believe everything you say happened to you.
But
I say
I believe
that-
it was a real experience.
Yeah, 100%. But I say they could have actually been during the trip. Like, they could have actually been talking without realizing it, and that light, which got represented as what your higher power, like, physically, you could have been looking at a light. And I'm not saying but I'm not. That's not being rude about it. I'm just saying, that your experience is what you felt, but physically, that's what it could have been portrayed. Did you see what I'm saying?
What allowed you to that point is if
it's real for you, that's all that matters.
But
that's how I feel.
When you shut your eyes, you don't. If you saw that light, which the light you would have seen, it doesn't have to be a real physical light. When you are tripping and your eyes are shut or your eyes are open, things around you are not real. If you shut your eyes, all of a sudden, it's not like, oh, my eyes are shut and I'm seeing this. It's like your eyes are shut and you're somewhere else for a period of time because you're just lost in your brain.
Yeah.
My argument to has always been, I believe everything you say about this trip, and I believe you saw all these things. It's
do
just
I.
whether or not they exist outside of your brain. That's
Yeah,
what
no,
I
totally.
question.
And I obviously, I will always, I do feel like humans will always try to go, how can I break this down in a way that makes sense to me?
Yeah.
And unless you experience the thing, you're always going to, someone's telling you something, it's like, how can I perceive this in a way that makes tangible sense, right? And I just, yeah, like the fact that, I mean, the other thing I should add to that point, like I met the friend that I was doing it with, and when we met each other in the Philippines, like a few weeks prior, it was like, hang on, I recognize you. But we've never met before. And when we were shown these timelines of like our existence, we were shown the amount of times that we'd interacted throughout existence. I know that sounds ridiculous. And I remember, and we were shown how like I'm quite like a naturally troubled soul, I'd say. And I was shown how I am carrying the traumas of all of these lives that I've previously lived with me, and I've not dealt with any of it. So I carry it on to the next life. And it was like we were both being shown this, and it was just all a bit like, I don't know.
This how you know
if that's just mental and that's just me dreaming, fair play. But it was a bit crazy,
but
mate.
but you know it's real for you. So, but the point is, no, but that doesn't matter. That's what Luke and I are saying. It doesn't matter if it's real or not real, mate. If it's real for you, that's the only thing that matters. It shouldn't matter what anyone else thinks or says about it. You know, you mentioned how you was I didn't know this, but you were seeing your friend. Is that in your life now or the previous lives? You know, you said you'd met your friend previously before throughout.
Yeah.
You're talking about in like previous life, not like in the last.
No. In different lives, like it was almost like we recognize each other because I don't know whether that's just crazy and that's just
crazy.
mental. I don't know, but I remember
crazy or
thinking
mental.
this is why, like the monks that we were meditating with, it was almost like clear. What we were experiencing now in this mushroom trip was connected to why they meditate. They tap into this realm that's all like way more enlightened and way more knowing what is through the meditation. And because they've tapped into that, that's why they do what they do, because they're aware of it. Whereas we just look at them like, what, they meditate all the time? How boring. But I just obviously believe that there is a higher realm. There's more than just what we can perceive here. What do you believe? Do you think there are more like other realms or other dimensions? Do you think this is it?
I've never had an experience like that, and I think that there are kinds of knowledge which can only be gained through experience. Like knowing what it is like to be in love is a famous example. Knowing what it's like to have children and to have this sort of emotional connection. You can kind of describe it, and somebody who's not had children could like kind of understand it, but until you've done it, mate, like you don't really know. Yeah. I think experiences like this are that turned up to 11. Like I couldn't possibly hope to comprehend what kind of experience you had. And people who have near-death experiences report really weird things. There's a famous example, which I think is actually quite difficult to track the source of this, but it will be stuff like somebody is on a hospital bed and then they experience themselves leaving their body. And they float up and they float out of their body and they see all the doctors and they float above the building and they see like a red shoe on the top of the building. This is the famous case. And then the doctors bring them back and the soul back into the body. And then they say, I went out of my body. I saw a red shoe on the roof. And they go up and they look, and sure as can be, there's a red shoe on the roof. That particular case is really famous, but very difficult to say if it actually happened. But it's that kind of thing. You saw something that you can now prove that something weird went on, because you shouldn't be able to know that. You shouldn't be able to know that there's a clipboard on top of that cabinet with a blue top on it, but you saw it when you nearly died. Whenever I hear stories like that, I'm like, man, that is just weird. And I can certainly understand why, if you actually experienced that, even if it was a dream, even if somehow you're now just misremembering what happened, it's still going to be bloody, bloody weird. Okay, so there's that. But the question I would have is, I always want people, as best as they can, and I know that it's difficult, to explain actually what you mean. Like when you said you saw like this demon in front of you, and I said, well, was it like as if it was sat on the table? And you said, no, it was kind of metaphorical. This is really important, like the nature of the vision. When you say that you left your body, for example, do you mean that you felt physically as though you could you see, could you hear? Did you look down and see your body underneath you? Or like, in what sense did it feel like that was happening?
So I literally shot up into the sky. It sounds crazy. Shot up in the sky.
With your
but I
body?
couldn't see my body, no.
Okay.
So I didn't even look at myself. It's just, I could see could see that my friend Seb was there. We should get him on Wafflin. by the
Did
way.
you look?
Could
Was your sight like direction? Was it like you could see this way and you could look around, or
Yeah.
could you just kind of see
Yeah, I was,
everything?
looking,
all at
I
once?
was looking around.
Okay.
There was this like kind of spirit being like guiding us the way.
Like as in like a you saw a spirit being.
I couldn't see the spirit; it wasn't physical, but we knew it was there.
Okay. So this is important, right? So
yeah.
it's not like whatever this spirit being thing that was there. It's not something that you saw. It's something that like you sort of somehow otherwise perceived was there. But this is why like a lot of people find it difficult to believe a story like this, because you'll say, look, I exited my body and I saw this spirit, and what they're imagining is like you like zipping up with your head and your body and meeting some guy who looks a bit like Obi-Wan, who when he's a ghost at the end of Star Wars. And you've got to be really careful to explain exactly what you mean. So the way that I've often explained psychedelic visions, for example, is when like people say like, oh dude, like the table turned into a chameleon or something. And I think for me, it depends what dose you're taking. It depends on, thanks man. I suppose it depends exactly what your experience is. But for me, visuals that I've had on psychedelics, and it's not like I've done a hero dose of psychedelics in the past, but I've had some pretty intense visuals. I think when I see something, like when I look into a bit of wood and I see a chameleon or whatever, it's a little bit like, the best explanation I have is, I forget the word for it, but like when something looks a bit like a face, and you see a face in it.
Personification.
Yeah, well, so it would be a kind of personification,
Yeah.
but I think there's a word specifically for seeing faces.
Like you see a
in
crisp
things. I
and it
forget
looks
what it's
like
called.
someone.
Yeah, exactly.
Jesus.
Or seeing Jesus in your toast or whatever.
Or me in a potato
You
smiley.
could call it your hyperactive agency detector. It might be something to do with that. But basically, like if I put these two cups like this, and I was like, take a look, eyes, nose. It kind of looks like Squidward. It's got like a big old nose, yeah. And you see a face, right? Right now I'm looking and I see a face. And if I said to you like I saw a face in the table, you'd be like, wait, what do you mean? Like, so I'm like, it's not like the table like transformed into a human face. I just sort of saw a face in it there in a way that I can't quite describe without just showing you, right? And I wonder if the kind of visions that you're having are more like that, are more like you can understand that you're seeing a spirit or whatever, but it wasn't like, it wasn't like literally a guy with arms who was like, come this way. Or if it was more like a physical vision, because this makes a huge difference. If you see a human face emerge from this table with skin and eyes that are blinking, it's pretty fucked up. But if you see a face because you've recognized a pattern that you hadn't seen before that's very believable. So the nature of what it means to see a face or see a spirit exit your body is really important to understanding how seriously a skeptic might be able to take a vision like that. So it depends on exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about, right? Yeah. So did you see your friend? Was he floating next to you?
So he was there, but again, his physical body wasn't there. It was like he was there, and then we were communicating
So you couldn't see
telepathically.
him?
Couldn't see him,
But you sort of felt
but
his
we
presence.
were communicating,
Uh-huh.
and then we both see the bright light at the same time.
How do you know you saw it at the same time?
Well, we see it, and then we land on the body, and it's just like, oh my god, that just happened.
Oh, okay. So you like snap out of it at the
So
same
well,
time?
not snap out of it.
Or
it
like
was
you're back in
we
the
both boom,
back in the room.
and it was like but yeah. I the thing is, I've told this story so many times now. It is just you had to experience it, or else it just does sound ridiculous. So
Look,
maybe we should
people have
move
had
on.
all kind. And here's one thing that's important to note, which is that like if you're a skeptic, atheist, you're always going to be able to think like there's some kind of naturalistic explanation for that. People will say, oh, it's just brain chemistry, as if that explains anything. Like I don't think that scientific explanations, a lot of the time, they don't actually explain anything. They just describe things. They don't tell you why. It's a great clip of Richard Feynman, a great physicist, being asked about magnets, and someone's just kind of asking him like, when I push two magnets together and I feel them, what's going on there? And he's like, oh, the magnets are repelling each other. And the guy's like, yeah, but like what? Like why? Why are they doing that? And you could say like, oh, well, we scientifically understand that there's this thing called a magnetic field, and they repel. It's like, okay, you're just describing what's happening, but like, why? Like, why does that do that? And there's an inaccessibility to that question that I think science suffers from. That what we think is a scientific explanation is actually just a description. So even if someone says that's just like chemicals in your brain, man, it's like, okay, but so is my experience of the color red when I close my eyes and picture red. Yeah, that's just chemicals in my. Okay, but what? Like why? Like why are chemicals in my brain producing redness? That doesn't make any bloody sense. That is completely meaningless. And so the atheist skeptic can always say these kinds of things, but you're going to be like, look, I had this experience and I can't explain it. One thing that we do know is that if there were some kind of immaterial mind and so to speak, spiritual realm. That's a non-physical realm in which you can exist in, but it's non-physical. So you wouldn't have a body, you wouldn't have like a physical, that you wouldn't be able to see your friend or whatever. If something like that really did exist, which by the way, people who haven't done psychedelic drugs believe. They believe that there is a heaven or an enlightened state or a extra bodily experience that you can have. If that were true, then we would expect experiences like this to occasionally crop up. And so it kind of depends on your presuppositions. If you're someone who believes that there is such a thing as an immaterial realm and whatnot, like why not? Why not? You just went there. Like, why not, right? Now, if you're an atheist skeptic, you're going to say, well, because it doesn't exist. But if you're like a Christian or something and you think, well, there is this part of yourself which is immaterial that will one day go to heaven or whatever. It's like, why then can't you have just had an experience that was real? What better explanation do you have? There's a story of, I think it's this guy called Joshua Bassett, who is like a Disney Channel star. He used to be on the Disney Channel, like one of these child actor types. And I'm pretty sure it was him. And he had a psychedelic experience. He did some kind of, I think he might have been like ayahuasca or something like that. But it was one of these where you sort of go on the retreat, And I can't remember, what drug was it that you said you were on when you had this experience?
That was mushrooms.
This was mushrooms, okay. And so Joshua Bassett is on this like retreat where they're going to take psychedelics or whatever, and it's like, okay, and he takes the psychedelic drug, and everything starts feeling a bit wrong, like his sort of people around him are like not friendly, sort of feeling these dark forces. I might be misremembering some of the details, so go and look it up, but thrust of the point is he was like, I need to leave. So he gets up and he goes to walk out, and whoever's leading the service or whatever is like, you can't leave. And he looks up and he just sees this like demon looking at him, like, you can't leave. You have to stay. And he's looking around dark energy of the room, like, and so he essentially just like barges past, like gets outside and starts to really freak out. He gets outside into the light. He looks up in the sky and he's like, you've got to be fucking kidding me. Because he just sees Jesus. He's like, God, there's no way I've just seen it. And he just sees Jesus. And he feels love and compassion, and all the problems go away. And now he's Christian. And it's like, what are you going to do with that kind of experience? Like, okay, yeah, maybe he was like predisposed to have some kind of religious experience involving Jesus. Maybe he interpreted the light of the sky as like the light of Jesus. Yeah, maybe that might be. So the atheist will say it's a primed brain on drugs and there's chemicals that are having a reaction that are causing that experience. Cool. Or Christianity is true and he just met Jesus. Like, either of those could be the case. I probably, at least in that case, lean more towards the former explanation than the latter, but I've got way more time for the latter.
I just argue, like, as long as it's real for him, doesn't matter.
But I think that's an interesting sort of...
If that's what I said, then just you might as well know one better. Might as well like prove anything, because if everyone thinks that something's real, then it's all right on them.
No,
like,
but I'm
why
saying
don't
for this in particular case, though, like.
But it is good to get to the bottom of like what is actually real and what isn't, like what is true and what is false. Like, as in,
yeah, it's good to have the discussion and stuff, but ultimately it does come down to what does it matter for him.
Truth is also a bit tricky, right? Like, because we talk about truth as if there's this thing called truth, which things either abide by or they don't. But there are all kinds of theories of what truth is and what it means to say that something is true or false. For example, I don't know, is it true that Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street? Is that true? Like,
I don't know.
Or like, is it true that
Yes.
is it true that Sherlock Holmes had a dad?
Well, yeah.
Oh, well,
It
he must have
is,
done.
right?
He has to have
Because he's a character and he's got a dad. But Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. So how can it be true that he had a dad if he didn't exist? There's a kind of a sense in which it's true, but not true in the way that I have a father, And it's sort of like, maybe there are things which like are true, but they're true in a kind of
Hypothetically
different
speaking,
kind
it's
of
true, though, is that a
way.
thing?
Yeah, but it's not just hypothetical, is it? Because like, Sherlock Holmes does have a father. Sherlock Holmes does live at 221B Baker Street. If I said Sherlock Holmes lived at 49 Baker Street, that would be false. I'd be saying something untrue. But how can I say something untrue about a being that doesn't exist?
Be fictionally true.
Yeah, but so what is fictionally true? What does that mean? Fiction means not true, right? If something's fictional, it means it didn't happen. So when you say fictionally true, what could you mean?
True within fiction.
But everything's true within fiction. But like, it's not true that Sherlock
Yeah, so
Holmes
everything is
lived at
true
49.
within fiction.
But it's not true that Sherlock Holmes is a woman, for example.
He's
That's
a man.
false.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are some things which are fictionally true and some things which are fictionally false.
Like alternate universes.
It's alternate ways of like understandings of what
This
truth
is why
can
we
mean
got
in
you
different
on.
contexts, right? Another good way of thinking about this is, instead of truth, think about existence. right? Things either exist or they don't, right? Okay, this table exists, right? Well, let's just say the table exists. The table's white, right? So the whiteness of this table, like the white quality of the table also exists. But the whiteness of the table couldn't exist without the table. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like you couldn't just have the whiteness of the table without the table itself. But you could have the table without the whiteness. You could paint it red. So the table exists and the white quality exists, but it seems like the table exists in a more fundamental sense than the whiteness. The whiteness exists like it sort of has less existence than the table itself. It's parasitic on the existence of the table for its own existence. So yeah, things either exist or they don't, but there are like levels of existence. This is like quite important, like for metaphysics, for the study of the nature of what stuff is. Like, what does it mean to say something exists? Okay, did Hamlet exist? Shakespeare wrote a play called Hamlet. There's a character. Did Hamlet exist? No, it's a fictional character. But there are loads of characters that Shakespeare never wrote. He never wrote Hamlet's,
Aunt.
Hamlet's aunt. I mean, maybe Hamlet's aunt is in play somewhere. I have no idea. But yeah, Hamlet's aunt doesn't exist, right? So Hamlet doesn't exist, and Hamlet's aunt doesn't exist. But it seems like Hamlet exists in a way that his aunt doesn't, because Shakespeare never wrote about him. So you've kind of got I exist, you exist, and then you've got a way in which like Hamlet or Sherlock Holmes exist, which is much less so because they exist in this fictional hypothetical space. And then you've got these characters that don't exist, like the characters that were never written. They could exist, but they don't. They seem to have even less existence than like Sherlock Holmes or Hamlet. You see what I mean? And then there are things which just don't exist at all, like a square with 3 sides. That definitely doesn't exist. And that can't even fictionally exist. So you've got something which doesn't exist, which is like a triangle with 4 sides or something like that. Then you've got like the character Sherlock Holmes didn't write. Those also kind of don't exist, but in a less foundational sense. Then there's Hamlet, who doesn't exist, but has some kind of existence that the other things don't have. And then you've got Shakespeare himself, who existed in an even more sort of higher level thing. So there are like contexts in which things can be true or false. So maybe there's truth and falsity of experience. You had a true experience. What the hell does that mean? Maybe the reason you say that's true, and you might say that's false, is for the same kind of reason why you might say it's true that Sherlock Holmes is a man, and you say, no, it's false because Sherlock Holmes didn't exist. It's like a miscommunication of the context in which you're talking.
With the triangle and the square thing, though, could you not argue that they only exist because we've let it exist? So like a triangle is actually a square with 3 sides.
You could
and
just,
a square,
you
or
could
a
just
square
define
is
it
actually a
that way.
triangle.
Just changing the name.
You could, yeah, but that's
that's my
would
point.
just
That's
be,
my point. It only exists because we
No, but it's okay,
named it.
the concept
the
of
triangle.
Yeah, but how?
is-
Who's
That's
to?
the name we've given it.
Okay,
but, like,
so
that object, that thing.
Yeah, but who's to say that as a human a species we couldn't say that everything's a square, but that's a square which is circular.
we could if we wanted to.
There you go.
That's
So,
just
but that's
language,
just
though.
language. So instead of if you want to,
We created it.
you're right. So, but if you want to avoid that problem, then the way that I would rephrase this is instead of saying imagine a square with 3 sides, I would say imagine an object which only has 3 sides and also has 4 sides. You can't do it, right?
No.
So that's the object that I'm asking you to describe. So that object, the object which has only 3 sides but also has 4 sides, doesn't exist. That thing I'm describing just does not exist. It definitely doesn't exist. And neither does Hamlet. But Hamlet seems to exist more
Well,
than the 3-sided thing with 4 sides.
I think this is a great segue into your belief in terms of the existence of God.
Mm.
I feel like that's your kind of biggest niche on.
Yeah, you're probably right.
YouTube.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Talking about-
obviously, you did the surrounded video, which
Yeah,
you
the
referenced
Jubilee
at the
thing.
beginning,
Yeah,
with
that's right.
where you were basically debating Christians on different statements that you made.
Yes, 25 of them or so.
Yeah, which that must be pretty
Intimidating.
intimidating, right?
You know what? It has the same syntax as one UFC fighter surrounded by 25 opponents. It sounds like, man, one person taking on 25, there's no way they're going to win. But you can't debate 25 people at once. You have to do it one by one. So really it was actually just debating one person who was like less prepared because they didn't know what the prompts were going to be and they didn't know it was going to be me 25 times in a row.
Yeah.
Which is still, it's an athletic feat, but it's a different kind of athletic feat, fighting 3 fights in a row and fighting 3 people at once, you know what I mean? And it was more like the former of those.
So, what would you consider to be your biggest argument against the existence of God?
Well, it depends what kind of God you're talking about,
Well,
right?
because does God not exist in the same format as Sherlock Holmes.
Ah, great question. Great question. Okay, so maybe like, okay, so there are things which like don't exist and like just can't exist, and there are things that don't exist but they kind of could exist. So the square circle doesn't exist, and neither do unicorns. But there's a sense in which unicorns like could exist. You can imagine a world in which they did exist,
Yeah, definitely.
but there's no world in which square circles exist, right? So there's this property of objects or truth claims and statements. They could be true or false. They can exist or not exist. But in either case, they can either exist or not exist necessarily, which is to say, like if it doesn't exist, it just can't exist. So a square circle doesn't exist. It necessarily doesn't exist, right? Or something cannot exist contingently, means it's contingent upon something else. So the unicorn doesn't exist because that's contingent on the evolution of our species. If it had evolved differently, a unicorn might exist. So there are things which necessarily don't exist and things which contingently don't exist. They both don't exist, but one necessarily doesn't, one contingently. Same thing for existence. There are things which exist, like this table, probably. This table exists. It only exists contingently because it could have not existed, right? Very easy to say this table could have not existed. So the existence of this table is contingent upon some other fact, like the fact that a builder put it together, right? There are also things which seem to be like necessarily existent, or let's start with necessarily true. So it's true that this table exists, but it could have been false. Like you can imagine, just conceptually, another version of the same world, which is the same as this one, but this table doesn't exist. So there's a possible world, so to speak, in which everything's like this, but there's no table. There are other things which are true, like 2 plus 2 is 4. Is there a universe in which 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4? Probably not. Because that seems like something that's necessarily true. It can't be false. So there are things which are true and things which are false, but there's kind of two kinds of truth and falsity, or existence and non-existence. Necessary and contingent. So things which contingently exist could have not existed. Things which necessarily exist have to exist, and they can't fail to exist. Okay. So, I suppose the reason that I bring that up is because contingent objects, like I say, like this table, they exist contingent on some other fact, like the fact that a builder put it together. Okay. That fact, that the builder put it together, is either necessary or contingent. It's not necessary, right? Because I can imagine that the builder never put it together. So it's contingent. What's it contingent on? Well, it's contingent on the fact that the builder showed up for work that day. Okay, that fact is contingent on the fact that he has a job as a builder. That fact is contingent on the fact that he needed a job and went and applied. So you've got all of these explanations for why this table exists that go back and back and back and back and back. Where does that chain of explanation end? Maybe it goes on infinitely. But as long as you get to another contingent fact, something which could have been false, there needs to be some explanation as to why it was true instead of false. And so every step in that explanatory chain, as you go further back and back and back, if you're still at a contingent fact, you need to go back further. Well, what caused that? Is that a contingent truth? Well, contingent on what? Contingent on what? That will either go on forever, or it will stop at some point. And the only way it can stop is if it stops in something which is necessarily true. That doesn't require any further explanation. So maybe the existence of contingent objects like this table, if you fully explain, remember how we started when I said that if you said, why are you here? I could say, well, because you walked in. That's true, but it's not complete. Well, why did you walk in the door? Oh, because you'd come up the hallway. Yeah, but why did you come up the hallway? Oh, because you got out of the car earlier. Oh, well, why did you get out of the car? If you actually fully explained all the way back, where would it end? Well, we could keep chasing that back. Well, because you got out of the car. Oh, because you woke up that morning. Oh, because you aged 20 years. Oh, because you went to school. Oh, because you were born. Oh, because your parents,
we know what they did. ...
Oh, because their parents met, because and you have to keep going back. And as long as you're still dealing with a fact which is contingent, which could have failed to exist, you have to keep explaining. And the only way that this ends is either if it goes back infinitely or if it stops in something necessary. Can't go back infinitely, because then there would be no explanatory start for the whole thing. So there must be a necessary truth at the basis of this, something which exists and explains the rest of everything else, which necessarily exists. And that is one of the properties that people ascribe to God. God is this being which necessarily exists, which is the foundation of reality. So that's like one way of thinking about the so-called argument from contingency for God's existence. I just did a video about this where I convinced ChatGPT that God exists using this argument. I've given a hopefully a not too complicated or strange overview of it there. But if people are interested, I try to really get into the weeds and explain every step of that in that particular case. But I can't remember why. Oh yeah, because you asked, does God exist or not exist?
What's your argument for?
Sorry, yeah, you were asking about
guess,
atheism, and I've just tried to prove God's existence.
But
silly
you must have an argument.
Yes.
Your belief is, I guess, at this point that he doesn't exist. But I know you're open to being a believer if you were ever.
I mean, my belief is that, like, I don't know if I would say I believe he doesn't exist, right? I'm not going to say I have this belief God doesn't exist. I'm just going to say I don't have this belief that God does exist. For example, do you think that there is somebody in the toilet currently in the building next door to this one? Like, are you convinced of that? Like, if I said, do you believe that's true? You would say no. I'd say, oh, so you think it's false? No, you're just agnostic, right?
Yeah.
And so somebody might give you a good reason as to why there's someone in the toilet. Oh, I thought I heard the train flush, and then somebody else might say, oh, but that could be explained by this or that and that. That's kind of what we're doing here. So my position is like us with the person in the toilet next door. I wouldn't
But
say
is that just like a positional thing? So is in like knowing that something's over there, whereas like it's not just knowing, oh, there's some God like over in the room over there. It's more of like reasoning. I don't know, how would you put it into words? Like the effects, like people would say that they experience what would be, they describe as the guidance of a higher power. Or, so it's not just like, oh, there's someone over there that we can't see. So because it's not tangible, it may or may not be there.
yeah.
It's like, this experience, this energy, this
Yeah,
guidance.
what I'm saying is
about
because
that?
I haven't felt anything like that, or I haven't seen that kind of thing. The
Have you been open to it? Have you like gone looking for it? Have you gone down that path?
Yeah, like to the extent that it's difficult to know because a lot of people say, well, you think you're trying, but you're not open enough. And I think I've tried. I really, really think I've tried. And
How did you try?
firstly, really important is being open to it. Like when you were telling us about your experience and even my listeners might be surprised to hear me say like, oh, yeah, maybe it was true, right? But like, if we're going to have this conversation, you at least need to try to put that hat on for that conversation. Otherwise, it's going to be pointless, right? And so, in religion, the first step is to actually
religion and God,
or God. Sorry, I should say, yeah, God's existence, or even just non-material, spiritual, whatever. The first step is going to be like, in order to say that you've tried it, you need to have first put yourself in a position where you believe in its plausibility. I think there's so much weird stuff in the universe that I very much believe in the plausibility of consciousness being immaterial, of the existence of God. I think that's true. And then being open to it just, I suppose, means not shutting down any opportunities to explore that. So if you start feeling a bit funny, a lot of people's like religious experiences happen in what do they call it? A hypergogic state, I think, which is between dreaming and waking. So you start having a bit of you're sort of dreaming, and sometimes you have a dream and you weren't sure it was a dream, like a false awakening, and you wake up and you check your phone and someone sent you a text, and then you wake up again and there's no text.
Yeah.
Where you couldn't quite tell if it was it, but it's like weirdly vivid, right? So a lot of people have visions in those experiences, and you could wake up, and if I had such an experience where I woke up and I had a text from Jesus that said, I love you, and then I was like, fuck me, I went back to sleep, and then I woke up. And I was like, bloody hell, and I looked and it wasn't there. I could just go, oh, that was just a dream, that was nothing. Or I could go, well, hold on, let's really explore this. Or was I definitely asleep? How vivid was it? Was it a uniquely vivid dream? Do I think that you have to at least be willing to explore that kind of thing. Now, I've never had an experience like that, but if I did, my openness hopefully would extend to taking seriously the possibility that maybe that was actually some kind of spiritual vision. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think
I've
most
never had
people
such an experience.
that believe in God don't go, oh yeah, I believe because like Jesus texts me.
No,
I think
but most people have some kind of experience.
Right.
And I've just never had such an
But
experience.
you said you gave it a go to like put that hat on. Like, what did you do to give that a go?
Well, there are a few ways to answer that question. One is to say that like I got a degree in theology. Right, I've tried my best.
Most people would say it's a case of like surrendering, going, I surrender to God.
Yeah.
I surrender to the fact that I don't have it all figured out, and I am open to like God's plan for me or something. Completely surrendering. That's how a lot of people would describe their like actually diving in head first and giving it a go. Have you ever done anything like that?
No, because of the fact that like in order to, as you put it, surrender to something, and people like like Christians will listen to what you're saying and go, yes, that's Alex's problem. He needs to surrender to Christ. And maybe they're right. Maybe if I surrendered to Christ, whatever that means in practice, I would become a Christian. But the problem is, right, I think I've done as much as can be expected of a non-believer, or close to it. Maybe I haven't, but I like to think that I've done a lot more than the average atheist should be expected to do, right? Okay, so you're an atheist. Well, how do you know? Oh, well, you should go to church and see. It's like,
Is
should I
there
have
any
to?
sense of fear
Fear of what?
of going surrender? Because the idea of, especially
Oh.
like as a territorial man, like the idea of, I want to
Yeah.
protect myself. I don't want to surrender. What?
Yeah.
Like, is there an element of like, I don't even want to experiment doing that? Because if I was like, all right, Alex, for the next month,
Yeah.
4 times a day, say the same phrases that basically, like, say the phrase that basically I surrender to God.
Uh-huh.
I am open to being guided, just to see if it is real.
Okay, so but to me, those are two different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saying I could say 4 or 5 times a day, I am open to being guided. God, if you're there, please let me in. I could do that. But saying I surrender to God,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? What does it mean? Like, how would I? So right now, I don't believe
Yep.
it's true, but I want to say I'm open to it. So let's say, okay, I'm going to trial a policy for the next week. I'm going to surrender to God. What do I do? Like in practice, like what do you
I
mean?
would say saying those phrases with conviction,
Uh-huh.
like genuinely meaning it. I surrender to God.
But how can
I
you mean
surrender.
it?
What do you mean?
How can you mean it if you haven't actually surrendered yet? So for
You're
example,
the one that's just said, "Oh, I put the hat on," so I've like done the research. So
what I mean by putting the hat on is putting the hat on of taking a position which I might otherwise think is implausible and treating it as though it might be plausible and saying like, even if all my instincts are telling me that's complete BS, that's nonsense, I'm going to put the hat on of being like, okay, let's consider if this might be true. That's different from saying I'm going to put the hat on of saying it is true, you know? So suppose, I don't know, have you ever tried being a Muslim?
no. Okay.
Okay, so why don't for the next week you surrender to God in like an Islamic sense, like submission to I mean, Islam means submission. It would require a different kind of thing to, I don't know what your religious convictions are right now, but you're not a Muslim. So for the next week, just surrender to God, to Allah, which is just the Arabic word for God, of course. Like, would you do that? And if you did, like, how would you do that?
I mean, I'm not sure about like the Islam faith and how I would go around doing that. I mean, I don't necessarily like prescribe to an actual religion, so to speak. I believe. I mean, that's a whole
you
other
open to it?
conversation. I'm open to anything. I think that's the thing. Like, I accept that I don't have it figured out.
So you can then be open to something. You can be open to the truth of Islam or Christianity or something without having to say like, I surrender to this thing and I've given it a go in that respect. You can still meaningfully say I'm open to it without even. And if somebody says, "Well, have you ever surrendered to it?" and you go, "Well, no," but I don't
that's
think that rules out my openness to
religions.
it.
If we're
Yeah,
saying
yeah.
like the concept of God, because imagine, right? Imagine all of us don't realize that. Like, imagine we're trying to figure life out and have it everything. Well, yeah, figure everything out the best we can with our little like pea brain, and that's all we've got. But there is this higher power that, if we allow in, can guide us in a way that we could never even comprehend trying to do so. It's like the same power as like 5 million of our own brain. Imagine there is that, but we're too proud to go, no, I don't even want to comprehend that because that's ridiculous. And I've got too much scientific evidence that that's ridiculous. Like, imagine we're just missing out on that guidance. Imagine we're missing out on that, what could be. That's why I'm very open to just exploring these things and like giving it a go. And I've definitely noticed, I mean, I have never really been someone that's like religious or like 100% there's a God or there isn't. But like giving it a go. And I've gone, okay, let me just try this. Why not? Give it a go. So let me surrender. Let me just see what happens. And one thing I will say, when I did give that a go, there's a lot of clarity. Clarity that came through of knowing what I want, what I'm getting pulled to do, things that are like, I'm getting a lot of fruit of my labor, and things that weren't necessarily just selfish things that were having a positive impact in the world, but also feeding me. I mean, I've just gone to do this Uganda wrestling video where I've ended up like finding this community that have made a whole entire wrestling organization out of nothing, but along the way found out that they have no health and safety services. And it's tied in amazingly well to make this video, not only to make my wrestling debut. I love wrestling. That's something I've never really had the courage to like pursue, but I really got a pull to do this. And also we're raising funds for them to buy an ambulance and an emergency care, and we're making like a really positive impact. And I'm like, that idea and that pull to do that didn't just come into, I didn't just think of that. I didn't just go, I'm just going to do this. It's like, I wonder if these ways that we get pulled to do certain things, there is a higher power that, if we allow in, can influence us in certain ways. I don't know.
Maybe the answer is to my question, like, well, you surrender to what is the most fundamental thing, right? Okay, and I'm saying, well, I don't know if that's possible. Like, you kind of have to be convinced that something exists in order to surrender to it. Like, if I said, will you surrender yourself to the police officer outside? And you're like, I don't think there is a police officer outside. But we'll just surrender to him anyway. You'd be like, I kind of literally can't, because if I don't believe he's there, I can't like surrender to him.
Isn't that everyone who does start believing or surrenders to God has to come from a place of not surrendering to God? So until you've surrendered and until you've actually done it, you can't go, I know for sure that there is a God.
Yeah, but that for me is the
Do you
great
get me?
catch-22, which is that I feel like I need to think that the thing exists in order to surrender to it, but I'm
So if you
sometimes
were a
told that I need
caveman-
to surrender to it in order to think that it exists.
If you were a caveman though, and you were
Yes.
told like, mate, there's this like Wi-Fi that's going to let you FaceTime your friend around the world right now.
yeah.
You'd be like, mate, I can't see what Wi-Fi. I can't see that. That can't exist. It's not tangible. I can't see it. I don't believe it's there. So therefore, I'm not even going to try and like FaceTime my friend, because what even is that? It's like that caveman can't comprehend the Wi-Fi concept. So what I wonder is that like, because we can't comprehend, or we say we can't comprehend something, because our brain is limited. We can't figure everything out.
Yeah.
Just shutting off and going, I can't comprehend it, therefore it doesn't exist. Is that...
But okay, so suppose I do hear what you're saying, by the way, and I'm trying to unpack it, but I guess I'm trying to explain why I would defend the view that without having done exactly what you're asking for, I've still done a lot. I would say, for example, imagine that I said to you right now that kind of Wi-Fi thing doesn't exist. It's not Wi-Fi. It's some kind of, let's call it Fi-Wi. It's this thing which like exists and will allow you right now, without the use of any device or anything. You don't need to pick up the iPad. You can just right now communicate with someone like down the street, like instantly, right? Okay. And you say, I don't know about that. I don't really believe it. And I say, all you've got to do, just try it. Just surrender to it. And you're like, how do I? Okay, like how? What do you mean? I'm like, you just have to surrender to this thing. So okay, well, how literally? Like, how do I act? Like, where is it? Up here? Where is it? Like, how do I close my eyes? And I'm like, oh no, because the thing that I'm describing is also, by the way, completely ineffable and beyond human comprehension. But you just need to surrender to it. I'd be like, I'm not saying I don't want to, or like I think that's a bad thing to do, or whatever. I just mean like in practice, unless I have some comprehension of what it is that we're talking about, I just find it impossible. Like, how would you surrender to the Fi-Wi? Or how would you, if I said just use it, just try using the Fi-Wi, you'd be like, I want to. I'm open to it. If you show me like where it is and how I use it, maybe do I put my hands together? Do I need to like do a flappy motion like Spider-Man, working out how to do that? But if there's no directional guidance, then what exactly? And so what I mean, I'm not saying there might not be an answer to this question, but I suppose that's what I'm asking you is specifically, what do you mean with like surrender to God? You said like saying the phrase,
Okay.
but you can say the phrase and not and just say the words. So what do you mean?
Say like your parents, when you were a child, guiding you somewhere. You either do as you're told, and essentially you're surrendering by like following their guidance of like holding their hand as you cross the road or something. It's like, I don't know. I feel like we know when we're surrendering to something.
People often feel,
we know when we're not.
People
When we're
feel like they're
rebelling,
being led
you know?
somewhere, right? Like if you're thinking, if you're starting to reflect on morality, and maybe you read like the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads or the Quran or whatever, and then people see, like, I just felt like I was sort of being led somewhere by this text. And maybe that's the thing that is required. You need to have this feeling that there is something which is guiding you, pulling you, a bit like your friend who was next to you in your psychedelic experience, where like they're there, not physically, not in a way, but there's just some way I can feel that it's there. And to surrender to God is to allow yourself to follow that where it takes you. Something like that, maybe. Because that is a... Look...
Imagine like there's just ultimate love out there for you. Like, ultimate love that you're just like, man, I don't want to experience that. Like ultimately, like that love is, I believe, like the ultimate experience, ultimate feeling, ultimate like reason for being, like love, give and receive love. Imagine there's that ultimate love up there that could be yours.
Can I ask you a couple of questions?
You're rejecting it. And that's, if you're saying like, what am I surrendering to? Imagine you're surrendering to ultimate love. And you're like, and think of it like that.
Was your I'm not going to dodge this question, by the way, but this idea that you're expounding here, and it sounds like quite passionately, like, when did this develop? Did your like psychedelic experience that you describe have something to do with this, or is there something else in your life that sort of brought you to that position
It
of
probably opened you to the idea of it.
like specifically the idea that like love is the
so-
thing that's like that
You
matters?
say you
it's
saw
the
this higher
foundation?
power.
Oh no, I mean that was seeing obviously like a light, but
But
like
that gave you a sense
that
of
was-
belief in
Yeah.
something.
that was
no?
well that was like the consciousness from where we're all from. It's like we're all part of this one like consciousness, and we all
Yeah.
come. It's like that's where we're from. That's what that feeling was. But I think this was just more of like, you know, every time that I've gone and tried to figure life out all by myself and think that I've got it all figured out and just it's all on me. I've just come unstuck every single time, and I think that's never got me anywhere. So I think it was the idea of like, okay, I'm going to be open-minded. I think traveling helped, seeing other cultures, other ways of living, and then it was just like, right, well, if there is the possibility that there is this higher power out there that maybe does have a better plan for me than what I think is best for myself, why not give it a go? What is there to actually lose if we think about other than pride, feeling silly, feeling embarrassed because we're surrendering to this thing that we can't tangibly see or perceive? It's like, give it a go, see what happens.
So where are you at now? Like, it sounds. Are you still just in the position of like, oh, I'm kind of open to this, or do you feel like there is this thing that exists and you have some kind of
I would
relationship
say
with it?
I regularly talk to God. I'm open to God. I speak to God. I surrender to God. And that's as far as it goes. I'm not sitting there 15 times a day, definitely don't recite the Bible. I don't go into any, specific religion or whatnot. It's more of just like that open relationship essentially, and accepting that I don't have it all figured out and that I trust.
You're referring to
essentially.
God as just like a higher power rather than like God from
Like I said,
Christianity
source.
or
Yeah, I'd
Allah
say it's
from
like
Islam
source.
or Buddhism.
By the way, a few things to note, just to sort of be the sort of well, did you know kind of guy. Like, in the history of philosophy, people have had lots of different ideas about what God is and what his attributes might be like, right? And so today, when you meet someone, when they think of God, they tend to sort of imagine somebody who is all powerful and all loving and knows all true facts. And you sort of envision, a lot of people imagine like the man in the sky. If you're a bit more sophisticated in your thought, you might realize, oh, it's not going to be like a man, it's not going to have arms and legs, but you're still sort of imagining some kind of agent that has properties, like it has this thing called power and a will and whatnot. But throughout history, people have had different ideas. So in the history of Christian thought, there is this idea called divine simplicity, which is really crucial to a lot of Christian and Catholic thought, which is that divine simplicity means that God is ultimately simple. He doesn't have parts. It's not like he's got this thing called powerfulness and this thing called beauty and this thing called... They're all just the same thing. And for a lot of people, it's completely impenetrable. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. But the classical theologians of this sort think that God is the same thing as existence, and that existence is the same thing as truth, and that truth is the same thing as love, and that love is the same thing as beauty. It's literally just the same thing in a way that is very difficult for humans to understand. It's just the same thing, right? The way that you describe love as like the foundational thing.
What I'd love to know, as yourself, someone who is agnostic, if you spent a month genuinely with your whole heart surrendering to God on a daily basis, just to know what happens. If nothing happens, fairs, you've learnt the answer. But imagine if you're like, hang on, I've felt it, I've experienced it. This is this has changed my whole entire scope for the better. I'll just ask that question.
You ever heard of a thing called Pascal's wager?
No.
You ever heard of this? So there's
Pascal Chimbonda?
there's a mathematician from when did it? Probably like the 17th century maybe, earliest 15th, latest 18th. I can't remember for the life of me actually at the moment. And a brilliant mathematician, undisputed genius, blah blah blah. Also a Christian, and there are a few interesting things to say about him. But he's most remembered for this thing called Pascal's wager, and he basically writes in his notes, look, imagine you're like placing a bet essentially, right? You're going to bet on God's existence or his non-existence. If you bet on his existence and you're wrong, who cares? Yeah, you got to whatever, like it doesn't matter. If you bet on his non-existence and you're wrong, oh boy, it's bad news. It's really bad news. Okay, so if you're wrong, you're better to bet on his existence. What if you're right? Well, if you believe in him and you're right, awesome. Fantastic. If you don't believe in him and you're right, so what? Doesn't mean anything. So in either case, it's better to just believe in him. Because if you're wrong, who cares? This is known as Pascal's wager. It's sort of like, this is a wager that you place, and it's much better to just bet on existence. Because, what have you got to lose? The criticisms people tend to make of this are firstly like, you can't choose what you believe. That gets complicated because you want to say, well, I can't naively just choose to believe in God, but I could choose to change my behaviors and all that kind of stuff. To tell you why I don't believe in that would probably require telling you why I don't believe in free will, which is a rabbit hole of its own. So I've got my problems with saying that you can sort of place a wager like that. But it's an interesting thought, right? Like, why not just place that bet? That, to me, the question comes down to how reasonable it is to say that it is possible to just spend a month surrendering to God before the belief in his existence. And if that's possible, then I agree with you that it's definitely worth a shot. And maybe it is possible, but I'm just thinking of it in the wrong way or whatever. But I completely agree with you and have so much time for the idea that that should be the case. Another interesting about Pascal is that he had a religious experience too. Lucky him. And he wrote something down afterwards, which was so profound to him that he had it etched into his jacket, which he wore. And he had this religious experience, and he'd done a lot of thinking. And when he had this experience, he wrote down, not the God of the philosophers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, not the God of the philosophers. He realized that the God that he believed in, and the God that he just had an experience with, was the God of Abraham, was the God of the Bible. It was not the God of the philosophers. It was not the first cause of the contingent series of causation that brings about contingent objects like that. That's not the God that he just met. He met the God of Abraham. You know what I mean? And so it seems like there is a common thread throughout geniuses thinking about religion, that at some point they have a religious experience and realize that all of that is just like nonsense. Like, what has that got to do with absolutely anything?
There's not an issue with this wager, though. Where you said, say you place the bet that he doesn't exist and you're wrong, and it's bad news. Surely, though, it's not bad news, because if the God God's all about forgiveness, right? Doesn't matter what religion. There's a lot of forgiveness in all religions.
Yeah.
Why does hell exist then?
You don't know that. It
That's a
doesn't
great
exist in
question.
all other religions.
Well,
Only exists in Christianity? Is that true? I don't really know. But my point is if that's the case, then why are there so many different religions?
Yeah, there are concepts of hell in lots of religions.
You see my point? So
within religions,
even if
people
you
have
don't
different
believe in
views.
a
But
God,
yes,
it shouldn't matter.
You're right. So it's like, okay, well, if God does exist, and I believe that he doesn't, I want to say, oh, that's really bad news. But why? Because what about forgiveness? Well, weirdly, for a lot of people, firstly, forgiveness requires genuine repentance. You can't forgive someone if they're not sorry. And you can't be sorry to a being that doesn't exist. So it would have to be that you don't believe that God exists, and then at some point, maybe when you die, you meet him and he forgives you. But now this is a bit of a mystery to me, and this is where my more atheist side might come out, is that it seems really strange to me that forgiveness is really important, particularly in Christianity, that as long as you repent and Jesus is your savior, you're freed from your sins by his sacrifice. But once you die, that's it. It's almost like you're locked in.
Yeah.
So as long as you're alive, you could have done the worst thing imaginable. But as long as you genuinely repent, that's no like trivial thing. If you're responsible for something truly evil, to genuinely be sorry for that would be a heavy, heavy thing. As long as you do it, Jesus paid the sacrifice, you get to go to heaven. But if you die while you're still in your sin, you don't. You at least don't go to heaven. Maybe there's a hell and you go there. Maybe you just cease to exist. Why is it that this possibility for forgiveness just ends at death? Because I sort of agree with you in that, it seems like if God is ultimately forgiving, then I could live the rest of my life not believing he exists, and then I die, and I'll get there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so stupid. I'm so sorry. And he's like, it's okay, man, But then that would seem a little bit weird, because if we could all just do that, then why would he bother putting us here in the first place, right? So it's a weird thing to work through, but what I would say is that most religious traditions do have an important conception of freedom, of forgiveness, but that for a lot of them, it kind of ends or it gets complicated by death. And so for the person who doesn't believe in God for all of their life, if God exists and they don't believe in him and they die and they've got it wrong, it could be very bad news for them, because they could end up in hell. Or
There's so many different beliefs out there.
That's true.
Look at Buddhism.
Yeah.
You come back as a Labrador.
No, that's Hinduism.
Buddhism.
Yeah, Buddhism isn't. They don't believe in a god, and that's more.
But they
like
do believe in
spirituality.
It's a reincarnation. That's Buddhism.
Yeah,
Reincarnation. is Buddhism.
samsara, the concept of reincarnation, which for the Buddhists the way that you escape this cycle is by achieving enlightenment, which is a very personal, again, a very personal thing. There's this famous Buddhist quote, and I wish I could remember who said it. It's very well known. I don't know much about Buddhism, but I've heard this quote where some famous Buddhist teacher said, if you are walking down the street and you meet the Buddha, kill him. Bit sort of jarring. But the reason he said that is because he realized that if you met the Buddha, you would go like, my goodness, teacher, like I'm going to follow you, like give me your wisdom. And the whole point of Buddhism is that's not where it comes from. You don't get it from someone else telling you what to do. You get it from within yourself. And so if you meet the Buddha, kill him, because that's just going to confuse things. You need to look inwards to yourself, right? Buddhism's very important on that. It is atheistic, yeah, like typically Buddhists don't believe in like a god, at least not the kind of god that like a Christian might believe in. Yeah, there are all kinds of religions, but some hippy dippy types who might not be all that hippy dippy say that on the important matters, these religions do kind of aim at the same thing to some degree. Yeah, so I've had on my show some people who are members of the Baha'i faith, and the Baha'i faith is a relatively modern religious tradition that cropped up in like, I want to say the 19th century. So not that long ago, and interestingly, it kind of grows out of a version of 12 Shia Islam in Iran. But now it's one of the fastest growing religions in the world, and they basically believe that there have been manifestations of God on earth. So they believe that like Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha, all of these guys were like, they don't call them prophets in the way that traditional religions call them prophets. They were like manifestations of God in a really sort of complicated, weird theological sense.
Yeah.
Bang, bang.
Man.
All right. What are we saying?
You've been by far the brightest guest we've ever.
Yeah, for sure.
Very kind of you to say, indeed. I'm flattered and surprised to hear you say that. It's funny, like I kind of didn't even do like the atheist bit, like part of the reason for that, by the way, is because I'm like the atheist guy, but I spent so long being like the atheist guy that like I started noticing that amongst a lot of atheists, and particularly people who aren't in the sphere of debate and discussion, you're just people you meet on the street. Someone who's a Christian, if I meet someone at the pub and they're a Christian, they'll probably have thought about it, Whereas a lot of atheists that you meet on the street, they're just, oh, no, I don't believe in God, that's all ridiculous. And I'm sort of like, oh, come on, give it a bit of time.
Yeah.
And so I've started to find myself, because of the experience I had in these discussions and realizing there are some good arguments for like God and Christianity and stuff, I find myself these days spending more time speaking to atheists about the plausibility of God and religion and consciousness being immaterial than I do doing the opposite. But I do the opposite. So just so it's clear to everybody, I do the opposite. Like the Jubilee thing, surrounded by 25 Christians, I'm like telling them why I think Christianity is not true, etc. Just didn't do it today, but don't read too deeply into that, ladies and gents. The Christian response channels that I can see you.
Where can people find you?
On those Christian response channels, probably that are currently saying like,
To be fair, you've made a good case for it.
Atheist proves God, hosts shocked by revelation from okay, yeah. So probably there.
You've got me thinking more about religion, to be fair, than I think I ever have.
Good. Well, that's
Whether that was your
an
intention or
immense
not.
compliment. Well, I suppose it is. Yeah, I like to get people thinking about things, and that's what you asked at the beginning. Like, what's the motivation? I have a message to sell. I don't want you to become a Christian. Maybe I do. That would be, maybe that would be good. Maybe that's
Do
the
you
best
worry,
thing.
just the last thing, that like, if imagine you did actually find God, would that ruin your whole like brand image now?
Well, what
You have to kind of like, oh shit, I need to keep it up.
does it matter if you gain the world but forfeit your soul?
What do you mean?
What does it matter to gain the world, to have all the things that you could possibly want, but forfeit your soul?
Does that mean as in if you were to find God but then lie and still pretend you're an atheist?
It means that,
that
like,
be-
I wouldn't think to myself, if I did lose my job and my career and my focus, I wouldn't think to myself, oh no, I've lost all the thing is, I'm in a really good position in this regard, which is to say, that's from the Gospels, by the way, which is to say that if I were a Christian who was like, maybe one day I'll become an atheist, if I became an atheist, I'm Christian and then I become an atheist and I've got this whole YouTube career based on Christianity, I'd be like, oh crap, because not only have I now lost my job, I now also think that like life is meaningless. Crap, that is like a double whammy, right? Whereas for me, it's like, okay, if I'm an atheist and I've built my career around being an atheist, I've become Christian, sure, yeah, maybe I'll lose my job, but guess what I've got in return for that? I've got like eternal life, baby, and I'm okay with that. But I also do trust that as long as I didn't like lose my mind, if I said to people one day, look, I've converted to Islam, Christianity.
Say if it wasn't a religion,
Mormonism,
you just found
or
God.
just said that I believe in, and like, or if I said like, yeah, I believe in some kind of higher power, or I'm not a materialist or whatever. I trust and hope that the audience that I have cultivated, particularly over the last few years, in particular, I mean, trying to expound virtues of recognizing, of taking different views seriously and being fair and open, that they would see that, and even if they said, okay, man, this is where I check out, whatever, they would be like, fair enough. Like, I don't think you've lost your mind. So I actually wouldn't worry about it too much, because I think that there are enough people out there who would still probably be interested in my reasons for why that happened. And as long as it did happen for good reasons, I would have interesting reasons to talk to them about, And of course, if I convert to Christianity, then I can open a mega church in America and become a millionaire. So there's that too. So it's only up. It's only up.
Phenomenal. Well, thank you for coming on, mate.
Yeah, really
boy.
appreciate it.
It's
We
been a
appreciate
pleasure.
it. Very enlightening.
Thanks for having
Very
me.
great
yeah.
stuff. If you did enjoy it, obviously like, rating, subscribe if you are new, and on Spotify, what can they do?
Give us a 5-star rating, because it really does help the show out.
Boom. And any other guests that you would love us to get on, maybe a bit out there. Obviously, this is a bit of a niche one that we haven't. Well, Spencer, I think the Spencer episode, Spencer FC, was quite similar to this, but obviously this is a bit more religion, science. So yeah, any other guests that you want to see us get on, let us know in the comments. And until next time, peace.